It was the month of April in the year 1945. Europe was bleeding out in the final death throes of a war that had devoured entire continents, complete cities reduced to rubble, and millions of lives extinguished under the relentless weight of the most destructive war machinery that humanity had known until then. The Allied armies were advancing from the west, while the Soviet forces were pushing from the east, compressing the Third Reich into a mortal embrace from which there would be no escape. But no one, absolutely no one among those American soldiers marching through the dusty roads of Germany could imagine what they were about to discover. What they would see in the following days would change forever their conception of human evil, would haunt them in nightmares for decades, and would become one of the most harrowing testimonies of organised cruelty that has ever been documented. Before you settle in, take a moment to give the video a good like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are listening to us from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from all parts of the world. What exactly did those young American soldiers find when they crossed the gates of the Nazi concentration camps? How did they react upon coming face to face with the result of years of systematic persecution, of industrialized hatred, of death planned with bureaucratic precision? Why did some battle-hardened veterans, who had survived the bloodiest landings of the war, vomit and cry like children upon witnessing those scenes? And how is it possible that a regime that proclaimed itself civilized could have been capable of creating such a hell on earth? The answers to these questions will take us on a journey through the darkest moments of the 20th century, through testimonies that shape the soul, and through images that, even if we try to forget, remain engraved in the collective memory of humanity as an eternal warning about what we are capable of doing to one another. To understand the magnitude of the discovery that the American troops were about to make, we must go back a few months in time to the winter of 1944 and 1945, when the Second World War was entering its final phase, but was still far from concluding. D-Day had taken place on the 6th of June 1944, when the Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious operation in military history. Since then, the American, British, Canadian, and French armies had advanced step by step, city by city, across France, liberating Paris in August of that same year and eventually crossing the German border. But the advance had not been easy or fast. The Battle of the Bulge, which began on the 16th of December 1944, represented the last great German counterattack on the Western Front. For weeks, the forces of the Third Reich fought with a desperate ferocity, causing more than 80,000 casualties among the American troops and significantly delaying the Allied advance. The soldiers who survived those weeks of intense combat in brutal winter conditions believed they had seen it all, believed that nothing could surprise or horrify them anymore. They were wrong. Meanwhile, in the east, the Soviet Red Army had launched a massive offensive that took them from the outskirts of Warsaw to the gates of Berlin. And it was precisely the Soviet army that was the first to liberate a large-scale extermination camp. On the 27th of January 1945, soldiers of the 62nd Soviet Army arrived at an industrial complex of death located near a small Polish city called Oswiecim, known in German as Auschwitz. What they found there shocked the world and revealed for the first time the industrial scale of the Nazi genocide. However, the news about Auschwitz took time to reach the American soldiers advancing through Western Germany. Communications in times of war were slow and incomplete, and many of the initial reports about the concentration camps were received with skepticism. How was it possible that factories of death designed specifically to murder millions of people existed? It seemed like propaganda, wartime exaggeration, an attempt to further demonize the enemy. They would soon discover that the reality far exceeded any imaginable propaganda. The advance of the American forces into the interior of Germany accelerated during the first months of 1945. On the 7th of March, units of the 1st United States Army captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact over the Rhine River, a strategic stroke of luck that allowed the establishment of a bridgehead in German territory proper. From that moment on, the Nazi resistance began to crumble rapidly, although not without fierce fighting in some sectors. The American forces were advancing in multiple directions, some to the north, others to the south, and many directly toward the heart of Germany. Among the units participating in this advance was the 4th Armored Division of the American Third Army, commanded by the legendary General George S. Patton. This division, composed of combat-hardened veterans who had fought since Normandy, was advancing eastward through the region of Thuringia in central Germany. The soldiers expected to find more resistance, more cities to conquer, more kilometers to cover before the war finally ended. They did not expect what they found on the 4th of April 1945. That day, a reconnaissance patrol of the 4th Armoured Division was approaching a small town called Ohrdruf, located about 60 kilometers southwest of the city of Weimar. The landscape was typical of central Germany: wooded hills, scattered farms, small villages with red-roofed houses. Nothing indicated that they were about to discover something out of the ordinary. But as the armoured vehicles advanced along a secondary road, some soldiers began to notice a strange smell in the air. It was a sweet and nauseating smell, a smell that some combat veterans recognized immediately, the smell of death, but multiplied hundreds of times, as if an entire cemetery had been opened under the spring sun. Sergeant First Class Robert Gruber, one of the soldiers who was part of that patrol, would describe that moment years later, with words that would remain engraved in the memory of all who heard them. According to his testimony, collected in later interviews and military archives, the smell was so intense that several soldiers instinctively began to reach for their gas masks, thinking that perhaps the Germans had used some type of chemical weapon. But it was not poisonous gas that produced that unbearable stench. It was something much worse. Upon rounding a small wooded hill, the soldiers saw the barbed wire for the first time. Barbed wire fences several meters high, some electrified, surrounded a perimeter that extended for several hundred meters. Wooden watchtowers rose at regular intervals, although they were now empty. The gates of the compound were open, hastily abandoned, and beyond the barbed wire, the soldiers began to distinguish shapes that at first they could not identify. Some looked like piles of old clothing, others looked like fallen tree trunks. But as they got closer, the terrible truth began to reveal itself. What lay on the ground was not clothing or wood. They were human bodies. Dozens of human bodies. Hundreds of human bodies, piled up as if they were disposable objects, abandoned without any attempt at burial, left out in the open like garbage. And among the bodies, walking with staggering steps and empty stares, there were figures that barely seemed human. They were living skeletons, barely covered by rags that were once striped uniforms, with sunken eyes in cavernous sockets, with arms and legs so thin that they seemed ready to break with the slightest effort. What was this place? What had happened here? And who were these people who looked more dead than alive? The Ohrdruf camp was, technically, a sub-camp of the Buchenwald system, one of the largest concentration camps of the Third Reich. It had been established in November 1944 to provide slave labour for a series of underground construction projects that the Nazis considered essential for the war effort. Thousands of prisoners had been transferred there from other camps to work in subhuman conditions, excavating tunnels and digging air raid shelters, while being fed starvation rations and subjected to constant brutalities. When the American troops approached the area, the SS guards had received orders to evacuate the camp and eliminate the evidence of their crimes. Some prisoners were forced to march towards the interior of Germany in what would later be known as the Death Marches, forced walks of hundreds of kilometers, during which thousands died of exhaustion, disease, or summary execution. Other prisoners, too weak to march, were simply executed and their bodies abandoned. But the evacuation had been so hasty that the Nazis did not have time to completely destroy the evidence of what had occurred there. The American soldiers who entered Ohrdruf that 4th of April 1945 were met with a panorama that none of them would ever forget. Lieutenant Colonel Cameron Gruffy, commander of the 20th Armoured Infantry Battalion, was one of the first officers to arrive at the scene. In his official report, written with the characteristic dryness of military documents, but unable to completely hide the emotional impact, he described the following. Approximately 800 bodies lay scattered throughout the camp, some in improvised mass graves, others simply dumped where they had fallen. Many showed evidence of summary execution, gunshots to the back of the neck, skulls shattered by rifle butts. Others had clearly died of extreme malnutrition, their bodies reduced to little more than skin and bones. But what most shocked the soldiers were not the dead, it was the living. Approximately 400 prisoners had survived the evacuation and remained in the camp when the Americans arrived. Many of them were so weakened that they could not stand up. Others walked like sleepwalkers, apparently incapable of understanding that they had been liberated. Some dragged themselves toward the soldiers with expressions of disbelief, touching them to make sure they were real, whispering words of gratitude in languages that the soldiers did not understand. The division's doctor, Captain Joseph Gruber, immediately tried to organize medical assistance, but found himself completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of the humanitarian crisis he faced. The survivors suffered from a variety of severe medical conditions: extreme malnutrition, tuberculosis, typhus, dysentery, gangrene, infected wounds. Many were too weak to ingest solid food, and some would die in the following days, despite the efforts to save them, their bodies simply too damaged to recover. How had things reached this point? Who were the ones responsible for such an atrocity? And how was it possible that something like this had occurred in the middle of the 20th century, in the heart of one of the most civilized nations in Europe? The answers began to emerge as the soldiers explored the camp and collected testimonies from the survivors. Many of them were Jews, deported from their homes in various parts of occupied Europe: Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, France, the Netherlands. Others were German political prisoners, communists, social democrats, trade unionists, anyone who had opposed the Nazi regime. There were also Soviet prisoners of war, Romani gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals. All of them had been considered by the Nazi regime as undesirables, as elements that had to be eliminated from German society and eventually from existence itself. The testimonies that the soldiers heard those first days were so horrifying that many resisted believing them. The prisoners described workdays of 12, 14, 16 hours, performing exhausting physical labor with inadequate tools, while being fed with rations that barely sufficed to keep them alive. They described arbitrary beatings, summary executions for the slightest infraction, collective punishments that forced entire groups to remain standing for hours under the rain or snow. They described the systematic sadism of the SS guards, who seemed to genuinely enjoy the suffering of their victims. But perhaps the most disturbing thing of all was the meticulous organization, the efficient bureaucracy that had made such barbarity possible. The Nazi concentration camps were not simply improvised prisons. They were systems carefully designed to maximize the exploitation of the prisoners before their deaths. There were detailed records for each prisoner: name, identification number, date of entry, cause of death. There were precise schedules for work, for meals, for formations. There were established procedures for punishments, for executions, for the disposal of the bodies. Everything functioned with the efficiency of a factory, except that what was produced here were not consumer goods, but death. The news of the discovery of Ohrdruf spread rapidly through the American military chain of command. General George S. Patton, commander of the Third Army, was informed that same afternoon and immediately ordered a personal inspection of the camp. Patton was known for his toughness, for his aggressive attitude, and his contempt for any display of weakness. He had commanded troops in some of the bloodiest battles of the war and considered himself immune to the horrors of combat. But what he saw in Ohrdruf affected him profoundly. According to multiple testimonies from officers who accompanied him, Patton toured the camp in silence, observing the piled bodies, the mass graves, the skeletal survivors. At one point, he stopped in front of a shed where the Nazis had attempted to burn corpses before fleeing. The charred remains of dozens of bodies still lay among the ashes. Patton, the general who had crossed Europe fighting against the German army, the commander who had won the admiration and respect of his troops for his unwavering bravery, stepped away from the group and vomited violently. He was not the only one. Many of the soldiers who visited Ohrdruf in those early days experienced similar physical reactions. Men who had fought in Normandy, who had survived the Battle of the Bulge, who had seen their comrades die in countless engagements, found themselves completely overwhelmed by what they witnessed in the camp. The difference, some of them would later explain, was that in combat death made some sense, had some logic even if it was brutal. Soldiers died fighting, defending their countries, facing an armed enemy. But in Ohrdruf, death was gratuitous, systematic, devoid of any purpose beyond the cold elimination of human beings considered inferior. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, was informed of the discovery of Ohrdruf and made a decision that would have far-reaching historical consequences. Eisenhower ordered that an official visit to the camp be organized, not only for himself, but for the greatest possible number of American officers and soldiers. His reasoning was simple but profound. He wanted there to be as many witnesses as possible to what the Nazis had done. He feared, with an almost prophetic vision, that someday someone would try to deny that these atrocities had occurred, and he wanted to ensure that there would be sufficient testimonies to refute any future denialism. On the 12th of April 1945, Eisenhower personally visited the Ohrdruf camp, accompanied by General Omar Bradley and General Patton. It was a solemn visit, charged with intense emotions. Eisenhower methodically toured all the facilities, observing everything with deliberate attention, making sure to see with his own eyes every aspect of the camp. According to his own account, written later in his memoirs, he had never experienced an emotional shock as profound as the one he felt that day. In a message sent to General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, Eisenhower wrote, "The things I saw beg a description. The methods of torture employed were as refined as they were cruel. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things, if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." This statement would prove to be extraordinarily prescient, as in the following decades, denialist movements would indeed emerge attempting to minimize or completely deny the reality of the Nazi genocide. But Ohrdruf was only the beginning. As the American forces advanced deeper into German territory, they discovered camp after camp, each one with its own horrors, each one revealing new facets of the Nazi machinery of death. And what the soldiers were about to find would make even Ohrdruf seem like a minor prelude to the complete nightmare. What other camps were waiting to be liberated? How many more victims lay undiscovered in the forests and cities of Germany? And how would the world react when it learned the complete truth about what had occurred in the heart of Europe during the years of Nazi dominance? On the 7th of April 1945, barely 3 days after the discovery of Ohrdruf, American forces arrived at the gates of a much larger camp, a camp that would become one of the best-known symbols of the Nazi concentration camp system, Buchenwald. Located on a wooded hill near the historic city of Weimar, cradle of German classicism and home to Goethe and Schiller, Buchenwald represented a painful contradiction, the physical proximity between high European culture and the most absolute barbarity. Buchenwald had been one of the first large concentration camps established by the Nazi regime, inaugurated in July 1937 as an internment site for political prisoners, common criminals, and other asocials considered undesirable by the state. Over the years, the camp had grown to become a vast complex that included the main camp, more than 130 satellite subcamps like Ohrdruf, armaments factories where prisoners worked as slaves, and laboratories where atrocious medical experiments were performed on living human beings. It is estimated that between 1937 and 1945, approximately 250,000 people from more than 50 different countries were interned in Buchenwald and its subcamps. Of those, at least 56,000 died as a direct result of forced labour, malnutrition, disease, brutal punishments and summary executions. But these numbers, however terrible they may be, do not completely capture the reality of what it meant to be a prisoner in Buchenwald. When the American troops approached the camp, the SS guards had already begun the evacuation, forcing thousands of prisoners to march toward the interior of Germany in the terrible death marches. But unlike Ohrdruf, where the evacuation had been almost complete, in Buchenwald, more than 20,000 prisoners remained, too weak to march or simply abandoned in the chaos of the final days. And these prisoners, secretly organised by an internal clandestine resistance network, played an active role in their own liberation. The resistance movement inside Buchenwald had existed for years, operating in the shadows, sabotaging the production of armaments whenever possible, protecting certain prisoners from selections for the death, keeping hope alive in the midst of despair. The leaders of this resistance, mainly German communists, with previous political experience, had managed to secretly gather a small arsenal of weapons, stolen from the guards or manufactured clandestinely in the camp's workshops. When they learned that American forces were near and that the SS guards were planning a final massacre before abandoning the camp, they decided to act. On the 11th of April 1945, the Buchenwald prisoners rose up against their captors. In an act of extraordinary bravery, men who could barely stand took up arms and attacked the watchtowers. The battle was brief but intense. The SS guards, outnumbered and aware that the Americans would arrive at any moment, fled into the surrounding forests. When the American tanks of the 6th Armoured Division finally reached the camp that afternoon, they found the gates open and were welcomed by prisoners who had taken control of the facilities. Lieutenant Colonel Felix L. Sparks, commander of the 31st Infantry Division, described the scene he encountered upon entering Buchenwald as something no human mind should be capable of conceiving. The smell of death was omnipresent, penetrating everything, permeating the clothes and hair of everyone who entered. The barracks were crowded with sick and dying prisoners, lying on wooden bunks without mattresses or sheets, some too weak to recognize that they had been liberated, and everywhere there were bodies, in the streets, in the barracks, piled like firewood next to the crematoriums that had operated day and night for years, burning the remains of those whom the Nazi regime considered deserving only of annihilation. But beyond the bodies and the skeletal survivors, the American soldiers discovered in Buchenwald even more disturbing evidence of Nazi depravity. In the basements of the administrative building, they found the storehouse of personal effects confiscated from the prisoners. Mountains of glasses, of shoes, of suitcases with names and addresses written on them, of personal objects that had belonged to people who no longer existed. They also found the meticulous records that the Nazis had maintained, documenting with bureaucratic precision every arrival, every death, every cremation. And they found the remains of the medical laboratory of Dr. Karl Gensken and his colleagues, where they had conducted atrocious experiments on living prisoners, hypothermia experiments in which subjects were submerged in freezing water until they died or lost consciousness, experiments of deliberate infection with typhus, tuberculosis, and other diseases to study their progression, forced sterilization experiments, experiments with poisons, and with artificially inflicted war wounds. The medical reports that the Nazis had left behind described these procedures with clinical and dispassionate language, as if the victims had not been human beings, but mere laboratory samples. One of the most macabre discoveries took place in the home of Ilse Koch, wife of the former camp commandant, Karl Otto Koch. Ilse Koch, who would become known as the Witch of Buchenwald, had developed a particularly sinister obsession. She collected objects made from human skin, especially skin with tattoos. The soldiers found lampshades, book covers, and other decorative items made from the skin of murdered prisoners. This evidence of personalized sadism, of the reduction of human beings to raw materials for decoration, profoundly shocked everyone who witnessed it. The war correspondent Edward R. Murrow, one of the most respected journalists of the era, visited Buchenwald a few days after the liberation and delivered a radio broadcast that shocked American listeners. With his deep and measured voice, characteristic of his journalistic style, Murrow described what he had seen with a brutal honesty that many found difficult to listen to but impossible to ignore. "If I've offended you by this rather mild account of Buchenwald," his report concluded, "I'm not in the least sorry. I think most of you would have reacted just as I did." Murrow also interviewed some of the survivors, collecting testimonies that would help the world understand the scale and nature of the Nazi concentration camp system. One of them was an 18-year-old boy who had been deported to Buchenwald from Romania 2 years earlier. He had survived by working in one of the camp's factories, but he had watched his father and 2 brothers die. Another was a German Catholic priest who had been interned for opposing the Nazi regime and who had spent 8 years in the camp. Their testimonies, recorded and broadcast worldwide, provided some of the first direct evidence of what it meant to be a prisoner in the Nazi concentration camp system. What do you think of the content? Do you like this type of video? Then comment the phrase, "I want more stories." This way you will encourage us to bring more historical topics, and you will also help the video's engagement, okay? Also, do not forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like, so that YouTube continues to recommend our videos. But while journalists broadcast the news about Buchenwald, the American forces continued advancing, and every day brought new discoveries. Every day revealed new camps, new atrocities, new victims. The Nazi concentration camp system, which had remained hidden for so long, was being unveiled piece by piece, and each piece was more terrible than the last. How many more camps remained to be discovered? How many more victims were waiting to be found? And how would the Germans themselves react when confronted with the evidence of what their government had done in their name? On the 19th of April 1945, while American forces were still processing the horrors of Buchenwald, another army unit arrived at the gates of a camp whose name would become synonymous with absolute evil, Dachau. Located on the outskirts of Munich, in Bavaria, Dachau had been the first official concentration camp of the Third Reich, established just weeks after Adolf Hitler assumed power in January 1933. For over 12 years, it had served as a model for all of the camps that would come after, as a training school for SS guards, and as a place of internment and death for hundreds of thousands of people. The historical importance of Dachau could not be overstated. It was here that the methods of systematic brutality that would later be applied in all other camps were developed and perfected. It was here that the commandants who would later run Buchenwald, Mauthausen, Auschwitz, and the other camps of the concentration camp system were trained. And it was here that the Nazi regime first demonstrated that it was possible to establish a system of organized repression on an industrial scale, where cruelty could be bureaucratized and death administered with the efficiency of any other governmental operation. The troops that arrived at Dachau belonged to the 45th Infantry Division and the 42nd Infantry Division of the American 7th Army. They had received reports about the existence of the camp and knew, thanks to the news that had arrived about Ohrdruf and Buchenwald, that they would probably encounter disturbing scenes, but nothing could have prepared them for what awaited them. The first indication of what they would find arrived even before the soldiers saw the camp. On a secondary railway siding leading to Dachau, they discovered a freight train with more than 30 cars. The cars were closed, some from the outside, others partially open. When the soldiers approached to investigate, they discovered that every car was full of corpses, bodies of prisoners who had been evacuated from other camps and sent toward Dachau, but who had died during the journey from starvation, dehydration, asphyxiation, or gunfire from the guards. It is estimated that in that death train there were more than 2,000 bodies, piled in cars designed to transport cattle, treated with less consideration than the animals that normally occupied those spaces. The sight of that death train provoked an intense reaction among the American soldiers. Many of them were young men who had barely turned 20, coming from small towns and farms in the United States, who had grown up in a culture that valued human life and individual dignity. Being suddenly confronted with such graphic evidence of mass cruelty, of absolute disregard for human life, left them shocked and furious. Some wept openly, others cursed and struck the cars with their rifles, and some, consumed by rage, began to search for those responsible. When the troops finally reached the main camp of Dachau, they found the gates guarded by SS soldiers who had been left behind to maintain order while the evacuation was completed. What happened next remains a subject of historical controversy, but the basic facts are documented. In the chaos and confusion of the liberation, with American soldiers overwhelmed by what they had seen on the train and what they were seeing inside the camp, some SS guards were summarily executed without trial or process. The exact number of dead guards varies according to sources, but subsequent investigations suggest it could have been several dozen. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, who had also been present at Buchenwald, attempted to stop the executions, but the situation was out of control. The soldiers, many of them battle-hardened veterans, who had fought from Italy to Germany, were so infuriated by what they had witnessed that military discipline momentarily collapsed. Some historians have argued that these executions, although emotionally understandable, constituted war crimes. Others have maintained that, given the extreme circumstances, the soldiers' reaction was humanly inevitable, albeit legally problematic. What no one disputes is that the sight of Dachau profoundly affected all who witnessed it. Inside the camp, the soldiers found approximately 32,000 surviving prisoners, many of them in desperate conditions. The barracks, originally designed to house 6,000 people, contained more than 30,000, crammed together in conditions of extreme overcrowding. Epidemic diseases, especially typhus, had spread uncontrollably over the last few weeks, killing hundreds of prisoners every day. The American military doctors who entered the camp were met with a massive health crisis, and despite their efforts, many survivors would die in the following days and weeks, their bodies simply too deteriorated to recover. But there were also scenes of desperate joy, of uncontainable emotion. When the prisoners understood that they had been liberated, that the uniforms they saw were American and not German, many broke down in tears of relief. Some tried to embrace the soldiers, who often did not know how to react to these displays of gratitude. Others began to sing national anthems, songs from their countries of origin that they had not been able to sing aloud for years. And some simply sat on the ground, in silence, unable to process the reality that they had survived when so many others had died. The testimonies of the Dachau survivors provided crucial information about the inner workings of the Nazi concentration camp system. Unlike the extermination camps in the East, such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, or Sobibor, where the majority of deportees were murdered immediately upon arrival, Dachau functioned primarily as a forced labor camp. The prisoners were exploited to exhaustion in armaments, factories, quarries, and construction projects, fed starvation rations, and subjected to brutal punishments for the slightest infraction. Those who became gravely ill, or who could no longer work, were sent to the gas chambers or simply left to die. Because yes, Dachau also had a gas chamber. The Nazis had built it in 1942, disguised as a shower room to deceive the victims. However, later investigations suggest that this chamber was used relatively little, since the majority of Dachau's victims died by other methods: execution by firing squad, hanging, beatings, starvation, disease, or simply extreme exhaustion. Dachau's gas chamber represented the Nazi regime's capacity for industrialized genocide, although in this particular camp, less systematic methods of extermination were more frequently employed. The American soldiers also discovered in Dachau extensive evidence of the medical experiments carried out by Nazi doctors. The most notorious of these doctors was Sigmund Rasche, who had used Dachau prisoners as subjects in hypothermia experiments, supposedly designed to help Luftwaffe pilots shot down over freezing waters. The subjects were submerged in tanks of ice water for hours, while Rasche measured their vital signs, observing the process of death by hypothermia with dispassionate scientific interest. Hundreds of prisoners died in these experiments, and many more were permanently damaged. Other experiments at Dachau included extreme altitude tests, in which subjects were placed in decompression chambers to simulate high altitude conditions, causing internal hemorrhaging and death. Infection tests with malaria, typhus, and other diseases to study potential treatments, without any consideration for the well-being of the subjects, and tests of different sterilization methods, part of the Nazi eugenics program that sought to prevent the reproduction of those considered racially inferior. How was it possible that doctors, supposedly dedicated to the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm, had voluntarily participated in such atrocities? What kind of system could transform educated scientists into systematic torturers? And what did this mean for our understanding of human nature and the limits of civilization? These questions would haunt the liberators of the camps for the rest of their lives, and would continue to be debated by philosophers, historians, and psychologists for decades. But in those early days of April and May 1945, the American soldiers had little time for philosophical reflection. There was urgent work to do: tend to the survivors, document the evidence, identify those responsible, and keep advancing because the war was not over yet. The documentation of the concentration camps became a top military priority. Ordered directly by General Eisenhower, teams of military photographers and cameramen were sent to each liberated camp with instructions to record everything: the bodies, the facilities, the survivors, the crematoriums, the archives, everything that could serve as evidence of what had occurred. Eisenhower had understood that these images would be essential, not only for the war crimes trials that would surely follow, but for the historical memory of humanity. The film director George Stevens, who had gained fame in Hollywood before the war with films like Swing Time and Gunga Din, was one of those who received the mission to document the camps. Stevens had been assigned to a special cinematographic coverage unit and had already filmed D-Day and the liberation of Paris. But nothing he had seen previously had prepared him for what he found in Dachau. The images he captured there on 16mm colour film would become some of the most powerful and disturbing of the entire Second World War. Stevens filmed the piles of bodies next to the crematoriums, some partially burned because the fuel had run out before they all could be incinerated. He filmed the train cars full of corpses that the soldiers had found at the entrance of the camp. He filmed the faces of the survivors, their sunken eyes staring at the camera with expressions that no words could adequately describe. And he filmed the reactions of the American soldiers, combat veterans who wept openly at what they were witnessing. But Stevens also understood that the images alone would not be enough to fully convey the impact of what had occurred. He then decided to do something that would forever change his perspective on cinema. He used the footage he had filmed as evidence in the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders were prosecuted for crimes against humanity. Later, he would incorporate these experiences into his subsequent work, including his film version of The Diary of Anne Frank in 1959. Another filmmaker who documented the liberation of the camps was Samuel Fuller. then a young infantry soldier who had carried a small 16mm film camera with him. Fuller, who would later become an acclaimed film director known for movies like The Steel Helmet and Shock Corridor, filmed the liberation of the Falkenau camp, a sub-camp of Flossenburg. His footage showed not only the atrocities committed by the Nazis, but also the process of confronting the German civilian population with the reality of what had been done in their name. Because one of the most significant decisions made by the Allied commanders was to force the German citizens living near the camps to visit the facilities and see with their own eyes what had happened there. In Weimar, near Buchenwald, more than 1,000 residents of the city were escorted through the camp under military supervision. Many claimed that they had known nothing of what was happening behind the barbed wire, despite the fact that the smoke from the crematoriums was visible from their homes and the smell of the burning bodies reached the city when the wind blew in the right direction. The reactions of these German civilians were varied and often difficult to interpret. Some seemed genuinely shocked, weeping and expressing horror at what they saw. Others remained impassive, with expressionless faces that could indicate deep shock or alternatively complete indifference. And some tried to excuse themselves, arguing that they had known nothing, that they had been deceived, that they too were victims of the Nazi regime. The American soldiers who witnessed these forced visits watched with a mixture of satisfaction and skepticism, wondering how much of what they saw was genuine repentance and how much was simply fear of the consequences. The filmmaker Billy Wilder, an Austrian Jew who had emigrated to the United States and become a successful Hollywood director, was sent by the American Army to supervise the production of a documentary about the concentration camps. Wilder, who had lost his mother and other family members in the camps, had personal motivations, as well as professional ones, for this work. The documentary he supervised, titled Death Mills, Molinos de la Muerte, was compulsorily screened for German audiences as part of the denazification program, forcing the population to confront the consequences of what their government had done. But visual documentation was not the only way the evidence from the camps was preserved. Military investigation teams compiled thousands of documents, records, and Nazi archives that had survived destruction attempts. These documents included lists of prisoners, death registries, administrative orders, correspondence between officers, and even the procedure manuals that detailed exactly how the camps were to be operated. This bureaucratic documentation would be crucial for the trials that would come later, providing written evidence that complemented the testimonies of survivors and liberators. The testimonies of the survivors were especially important. Teams of military interrogators, many of them American Jews who spoke German or Yiddish, were sent to the liberated camps to interview the survivors while their memories were still fresh. These interviews, recorded and transcribed, provided first-hand accounts of daily life in the camps, of the guards' methods, of individual experiences of suffering and survival. Many of these testimonies would be used in the Nuremberg trials and other subsequent proceedings against Nazi war criminals. One of the most eloquent survivors to give testimony was Elie Wiesel, then a 16-year-old teenager, who had been liberated from Buchenwald. Wiesel, who would later become a world-famous writer and winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, would describe his experience in the camp in his work Night, published for the first time in 1958. But in the days immediately following the liberation, Wiesel, like many other survivors, was too traumatized to speak coherently about what he had lived through. Years would pass before he could find the words to express the inexpressible. Another prominent survivor was Viktor Frankl, an Austrian psychiatrist who had been deported to several camps, including Auschwitz. Frankl, who lost his wife, his parents, and his brother in the camps, would use his experience as the basis for developing his theory of logotherapy, centered on the search for meaning as the fundamental motivation of the human being. His book, Man's Search for Meaning, published shortly after the war, would become one of the most influential texts of the 20th century, translated into dozens of languages and read by millions of people all over the world. How did the survivors find meaning in the midst of such suffering? What allowed them to maintain the will to live when everything around them seemed designed to destroy them? And what could their experiences teach future generations about the human capacity for both evil and resistance? These questions opened deep psychological and philosophical dimensions that were barely beginning to be explored in those early days after the liberation. But for the American soldiers who had discovered the camps, the most immediate questions were more practical: how to help the survivors, how to process what they had seen, and how to continue fighting in a war that had not yet ended. The end of the war in Europe arrived on the 8th of May 1945, when Germany signed the unconditional surrender. For the soldiers who had liberated the concentration camps, Victory in Europe Day was a moment of relief, but also of somber reflection. They had won the war, but what they had discovered in the camps had shown them exactly what they had been fighting against. The military victory over Nazism had been necessary, but not sufficient. Now came the much longer and difficult work of understanding, documenting, and judging what had occurred. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, represented the first systematic attempt to hold Nazi leaders accountable for their crimes. 24 of the regime's top officials were prosecuted, including figures like Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Albert Speer, and others. The charges included crimes against peace, planning and conducting a war of aggression, war crimes, violations of the laws of war, and crimes against humanity, persecution and extermination of civilian populations. For the first time in history, the principle was established that individuals could be held personally responsible for crimes committed in the name of a state. This represented a fundamental legal innovation. National sovereignty could no longer serve as a shield against responsibility for massive atrocities. The accused could not simply argue that they were following orders or acting in compliance with the laws of their country. There were higher principles of humanity that prevailed over any national legislation. The evidence presented at Nuremberg included many of the photographs, films, and documents gathered during the liberation of the camps. The images of Dachau, Buchenwald, Erdrich, and other camps were projected in the courtroom, forcing the accused to visually confront the results of the policies they had designed and implemented. Some of the accused showed apparent remorse, others remained impassive, and Hermann Göring committed suicide the night before his scheduled execution, thus avoiding facing the executioner. But the Nuremberg trials were only the beginning of the post-genocide justice process. In the following years and decades, thousands of Nazi war criminals would be prosecuted in courts across various countries, from former concentration camp guards to administrative officials who had organized the logistics of deportation and extermination. Some escaped justice, fleeing to South America or other regions where they could live under false identities. Others were captured decades later, including the infamous Adolf Eichmann, logistical architect of the Jewish genocide, who was kidnapped by Israeli agents in Argentina in 1960 and brought to trial in Jerusalem. For the American soldiers who had liberated the camps, the return to civilian life was often difficult. Many of them suffered what we would recognize today as post-traumatic stress disorder, although at that time the term and the diagnosis did not formally exist yet. The images of what they had seen haunted them in nightmares, in intrusive memories that arose without warning, in difficulties relating to family and friends, who could not understand what they had experienced. Some found it difficult to speak about their experiences, keeping silent for decades about what they had witnessed. Others tried to process their trauma by talking, writing, giving testimonies, but found that words often seemed insufficient to convey the reality of what they had seen. And some actively involved themselves in genocide education efforts, feeling an obligation to ensure that future generations knew and remembered what had happened. One veteran who dedicated a large part of his later life to education about the genocide was Leon Bass, an African-American soldier who had served in a segregated unit of the US Army and who was one of the liberators of Buchenwald. Bass, who had personally experienced racial discrimination in his own country, found in the liberation of the camp a transformative experience that connected his own fight for civil rights with the broader struggle against all forms of hatred and oppression. For decades after the war, Bass travelled across the United States, giving talks in schools and universities, recounting what he had seen and connecting it with lessons on tolerance and human rights. Another veteran who became an educator was Harry Snodgrass, a military chaplain who administered to the Dachau survivors in the days immediately following the liberation. Snodgrass, profoundly affected by what he had witnessed, dedicated the rest of his religious career to promoting interfaith dialogue and understanding between Jews and Christians, believing that the Nazi genocide had been possible in part due to centuries of Christian anti-Semitism. But not all veterans found constructive ways to process their experiences. Some succumbed to alcoholism, to depression, to failed marriages, and to lives marked by unhappiness. The weight of what they had seen was simply too much for some, and the lack of adequate psychological support at that time meant that many struggled alone with their inner demons. How could anyone fully process the sight of thousands of bodies piled like garbage? How could anyone forget the eyes of the survivors? Those empty stares that seemed to have seen too much of human darkness? And how could anyone return to the normality of everyday life after having witnessed the absolute rock bottom of the human capacity for evil? These questions had no easy answers, and for many veterans, they never did. What they did do was carry their memories, some in silence, others sharing them with anyone who would listen, all indelibly marked by those days of April and May 1945, when the veil was lifted and the world saw the full face of Nazi evil for the first time. The memory of the liberated camps also had a profound impact on American society at large. The news and images of the camps, widely disseminated by the media, confronted the American public with the reality of why it had been necessary to fight this war. For many, the images of Dachau and Buchenwald retroactively validated the enormous sacrifice the nation had made, the more than 400,000 American lives lost in the conflict. But the images also raised uncomfortable questions. Why had more not been done to stop the genocide while it was happening? Why had the train tracks leading to the extermination camps not been bombed? Why had Jewish refugees trying to flee Europe encountered so many difficulties emigrating to the United States before the war? These questions would fuel debates that would continue for decades about the moral responsibility of the Allied nations in the face of the genocide that was occurring under their partial knowledge. Because the truth is that the Allied governments knew something about what was happening in the Nazi camps, although perhaps not the complete scale of the atrocities. Intelligence agency reports, testimonies from refugees who had managed to escape, and even public statements from the Nazi regime itself had provided clear indications of the systematic persecution of Jews and other groups. However, actions to rescue potential victims or to interrupt the machinery of genocide had been limited, partly due to the military priorities of the war and partly due to the latent anti-Semitism that also existed in Allied societies. This moral ambiguity was reflected in the experiences of some of the liberating soldiers themselves. Many of them had grown up in a society where anti-Semitism, although less extreme than in Germany, was still common. Some had heard derogatory comments about Jews in their hometowns, or had absorbed anti-Semitic stereotypes from popular culture. The confrontation with the concentration camps forced many of these soldiers to reconsider their own attitudes and prejudices, and to question the preconceived ideas they had absorbed in their communities of origin. What happened inside those soldiers when they were confronted with the contradiction between the stereotypes they had heard about Jews and the reality of the innocent victims they saw before their eyes? How did they reconcile the image of the abstract enemy with the concrete faces of children, the elderly, and entire families who had been exterminated simply for belonging to a particular ethnic or religious group? And what lessons would they draw from this experience for the rest of their lives? For many of those young Americans, The liberation of the camps represented a moment of profound personal transformation. Veterans who years later would give testimony described how that experience forced them to examine their own beliefs, their own prejudices, their own capacity for both compassion and indifference. Some became active defenders of civil rights in the United States, drawing explicit connections between the persecution they had witnessed in Europe and the racial discrimination that existed in their own country. Others dedicated themselves to education about the genocide, feeling the moral obligation to ensure that future generations knew the truth about what had occurred. The process of documenting the camps continued for weeks and months after the initial liberations. Specialized investigation teams were sent to systematically collect evidence, interview survivors and witnesses, and prepare the materials that would be used in the upcoming trials. This meticulous work revealed increasingly disturbing details about the operation of the Nazi concentration camp system, about the scale of the genocide, and about the participation of thousands of individuals in the machinery of death. One of the most shocking aspects that emerged from this documentation was the extent of the camp system. When American soldiers discovered Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, and Dachau, many assumed they were seeing the entirety of the Nazi concentration camp system. But the reality was much vaster and more complex. The Third Reich had established more than 42,000 camps of various types throughout all occupied Europe: main concentration camps, satellite subcamps, forced labour camps, transit camps, ghettos, and the fearsome extermination camps located primarily in Polish territory. The extermination camps represented a particularly sinister category within this system. Unlike the concentration camps, where prisoners were exploited as slave labour before dying, the extermination camps had been designed with a single purpose: the massive and efficient murder of human beings. Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Chelmno, Majdanek, and Belzec were the names of these centres of industrialised annihilation, where millions of people, mainly Jews, were murdered in gas chambers and their bodies incinerated in crematoriums that operated 24 hours a day. The majority of these extermination camps were located in occupied Polish territory and were liberated by the Soviet Red Army before American forces reached Germany. However, the Mauthausen camp, located in Austria, was liberated by American troops on the 5th of May 1945, barely 3 days before the end of the war in Europe. What they found there added new dimensions to the panorama of Nazi suffering. Mauthausen had been established in August 1938, shortly after the annexation of Austria by Germany. Unlike other camps that functioned primarily as forced labour centres, Mauthausen had been classified by the SS as a Category 3 camp, the most severe level, reserved for prisoners considered incorrigible or particularly dangerous to the regime. The mortality rate in Mauthausen was extraordinarily high, even compared to other camps in the concentration camp system. The most distinctive feature of Mauthausen was its granite quarry, known as the Wiener Graben. The prisoners were forced to work in this quarry in brutal conditions, carrying heavy blocks of stone up a staircase of 186 steps known as the Stairs of Death. The SS guards frequently pushed the prisoners from the top of the quarry, watching them fall to their deaths against the rocks below. On other occasions, they forced groups of prisoners to run toward the edge of the precipice, where they had the option of jumping into the void or being shot in the back. This systematic sadism made Mauthausen one of the most feared camps in the entire Nazi system. When the troops of the 11th Armoured Division of the American Third Army arrived at Mauthausen, they found approximately 16,000 surviving prisoners, many of them in desperate conditions. The barracks were overcrowded, epidemic diseases had spread unchecked, and unburied bodies lay throughout the compound. But perhaps the most shocking thing was the discovery of the remains of prisoners who had been murdered in the final days before the liberation, when the SS guards attempted to eliminate witnesses to their crimes before fleeing. Sergeant Albert Kosiak, one of the first American soldiers to enter Mauthausen, left a chilling testimony of what he found. According to his account, collected in later interviews, the first impression was the silence. Unlike what might be expected from a place where thousands of people were locked up, the camp was enveloped in an unnatural silence. The prisoners, too weak to move or speak, lay on their bunks or crawled on the ground, their eyes following the soldiers with expressions of disbelief. Many did not seem to understand that they had been liberated. They had lost the capacity to expect anything good from other human beings. But among the survivors of Mauthausen, there were also stories of extraordinary resistance. A group of Spanish prisoners, Republicans who had fled to France after the Civil War and had later been deported to the Nazi camps, following the German occupation of France, had managed to maintain a clandestine organization for years. These Spanish Republicans, many of them with prior military experience, had established mutual support networks, sharing food, caring for the sick, and preserving human dignity amid systematic degradation. One of these Spanish survivors was Francisco Boix, a young photographer from Barcelona, who had been assigned to work in the camp's photographic laboratory. In this position, Boix had access to the official photographs that the Nazis took of the camp, including images of tortures, executions, and other crimes. At enormous risk to his life, Boix managed to steal and hide more than 20,000 photographic negatives, concealing them with the help of Spanish civilians working in nearby construction. These photographs would become crucial evidence in the Nuremberg trials, and Boix would be one of the few concentration camp survivors to testify personally in those historic proceedings. Francisco Boix's story illustrates a frequently forgotten aspect of the concentration camp experience: resistance. Despite impossible conditions, despite the constant risk of death, thousands of prisoners found ways to resist, to preserve their humanity, to help others, to document the crimes being committed against them. This resistance took many forms, from acts of sabotage in the armaments factories to the creation of clandestine education and culture networks, from the rescuing of children to the preservation of testimonies that would someday serve as historical evidence. How did these prisoners find the strength to resist when everything around them was designed to destroy them physically and spiritually? What internal resources allowed them to maintain hope when hope seemed irrational? And what can we learn from their example about the capacity of the human spirit to survive even in the most extreme circumstances? These questions would fascinate psychologists, philosophers, and theologians for decades after the war, generating a vast literature on the psychology of survival and the existential meaning of suffering. Viktor Frankl, the Viennese psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz and other camps, would develop his theory of logotherapy based precisely on these observations. Those prisoners who managed to find some meaning in their experience, some reason to continue living, had a higher probability of surviving than those who lost all hope. Frankl observed that prisoners who clung to a future goal, whether it was reuniting with loved ones, completing an artistic or intellectual work, or simply bearing witness to what they had seen, demonstrated remarkable resilience even when their bodies were on the verge of collapse. This observation led him to formulate his famous conclusion: "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." This idea, born literally from the ashes of the concentration camps, would become one of the pillars of modern psychotherapy. But not all survivors found constructive ways to process their experiences. The psychological trauma of the camps left deep scars that many never managed to completely overcome. Psychologists who worked with survivors in the post-war years documented a set of symptoms that would come to be known as survivor syndrome: guilt for having survived when so many others died, difficulty experiencing joy or pleasure, recurring nightmares, generalized mistrust of other human beings, and a persistent feeling that the camp experience had permanently separated them from the rest of humanity. Many survivors struggled for years to reintegrate into normal society. Some found it difficult to establish intimate relationships, unable to fully trust others, or to believe that the world was fundamentally safe. Others developed obsessive behaviors related to food or security, unable to forget the years when survival depended on getting an extra ration of bread or avoiding the guards' attention. And some never spoke of their experiences, keeping silent for decades about what they had lived through, unable to find the right words or fearful that no one could understand them. This silence had both individual and collective consequences. At an individual level, many survivors bore the weight of their traumatic memories alone, without the benefit of psychological support that could have facilitated their processing. At a collective level, the silence contributed to a certain invisibilization of the survivors' experience during the early post-war years, when society seemed more interested in looking forward than in confronting the horrors of the recent past. This dynamic was especially pronounced in some European countries, where the local population had been complicit, actively or passively, in the Nazi genocide. In France, for example, the myth of a widespread resistance against the German occupation obscured for decades the reality of the Vichy regime's collaboration in the deportation of French Jews. In Poland, the complex relationships between the Polish population and their Jewish neighbours before and during the war were frequently simplified or ignored. And in Germany itself, the process of denazification carried out by the Allied occupation forces had mixed results, with many former officials and collaborators of the Nazi regime quickly integrating into the new post-war society. For the American soldiers who returned home after the war, the experience of the camps also posed particular challenges. Many found it difficult to communicate to their families and friends what they had witnessed. The words seemed inadequate, the descriptions insufficient. How could one explain to someone who had not been there the smell of decomposing bodies, the empty eyes of the survivors, the unnatural silence of the barracks? Some veterans tried to tell their stories and encountered disbelief or discomfort in their listeners, which led them to keep silent. Others simply decided that some experiences were too painful to share. What happened to those unexpressed memories? How did it affect the veterans to bear alone the weight of what they had seen? And what did it mean for American society at large to have thousands of direct witnesses whose stories remained largely untold? These questions acquired new urgency as decades passed and the generation that had lived the war began to age. Historians, educators, and activists started to worry about the preservation of the testimonies of those who had directly witnessed the camps, both survivors and liberators. If these stories were not collected and preserved, they would be lost forever when the last generation of witnesses disappeared. This concern gave rise to numerous oral history projects dedicated to collecting and preserving testimonies about the Nazi genocide. The best known of these projects is the Shoah Foundation, established by film director Steven Spielberg after the filming of Schindler's List in 1994. The foundation has collected more than 55,000 videotaped testimonies from survivors of the Jewish genocide and other genocides, creating an invaluable archive for researchers and educators around the world. But in addition to the survivors' testimonies, the stories of the American liberators have also been collected. Organizations like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington and various universities have carried out systematic projects to interview veterans who participated in the liberation of the camps. These testimonies provide a unique perspective on the emotional and psychological impact of the discovery of the camps, complementing the stories of the survivors with the reactions of those who found them. One of the most eloquent testimonies collected in these projects is that of veteran William Landgren, who participated in the liberation of Dachau as an infantry soldier at 20 years old. In an interview recorded decades after the war, Landgren described how the experience of Dachau had haunted him throughout his life. "Not a day goes by that I don't think about it," he said. "I see those faces, those eyes, every time I close mine. At first I tried to forget, to bury it all in some corner of my mind where I wouldn't have to face it. But it doesn't work that way. The memories return. They always return, usually when you least expect it. Landgren also described how his experience in Dachau had changed his perspective on humanity and on his own moral responsibility. Before the war, I was just a kid from a small town in Minnesota. I didn't know much about the world, about politics, about what human beings are capable of doing to each other. Dachau taught me all that at once, in a few hours, and it taught me that we cannot simply look the other way when injustices occur, that we have the obligation to speak, to act, to not be accomplices through our silence. This sense of moral responsibility was shared by many liberating veterans who felt that their experience imposed an obligation of testimony on them. Some became formal educators, giving talks in schools and universities about what they had witnessed. Others expressed their responsibility in more private ways, making sure that their children and grandchildren knew the history, passing down the memories from generation to generation. The veteran Leon Bass, the African-American soldier who had participated in the liberation of Buchenwald, became one of the most active and eloquent educators on the Nazi genocide. Bass, who had personally experienced racial discrimination in the segregated United States military, found in the liberation of Buchenwald an experience that connected his own struggle for civil rights with the broader fight against all forms of hatred and oppression. In his numerous public talks, Bass would describe how the sight of Buchenwald had transformed his understanding of prejudice and discrimination. "I saw what can happen when hatred becomes government policy," he said. "I saw the end result of dehumanization, of turning other human beings into objects, into numbers, into disposable garbage. And I realized that the same kind of thinking that had led the Nazis to create the concentration camps was the same kind of thinking that existed in my own country, which treated me as a second-class citizen because of the color of my skin." Bass established explicit connections between the Nazi genocide and the history of racial oppression in the United States, including slavery, lynchings, and segregation laws. His message was that hatred and intolerance were not problems exclusive to Germany or Europe, but universal tendencies that could manifest in any society if not actively combated. This message resonated deeply with American audiences, especially during the decades of civil rights struggle that followed the Second World War. The connection between the experience of the Nazi genocide and the civil rights movements in the United States was more than rhetorical. Some survivors of the Jewish genocide who emigrated to the United States actively involved themselves in the struggle for African American civil rights, seeing parallels between the discrimination they had experienced in Europe and what they witnessed in their new country. And some African American activists, including figures like Martin Luther King Jr., made explicit reference to the Nazi genocide in their speeches and writings as a warning about the extreme consequences of institutionalized racism. This interconnection of struggles for justice and human rights represents one of the most significant legacies of the liberation of the camps. The experience of the Nazi genocide demonstrated irrefutably that discrimination, hatred, and dehumanization can lead to catastrophic consequences if allowed to grow unopposed. This lesson has informed decades of human rights activism, from the civil rights movements in the United States to the anti-apartheid struggles in South Africa, from humanitarian interventions in ethnic conflicts to contemporary efforts to combat discrimination and hatred in all their forms. But the memory of the genocide has also been instrumentalized and debated in complex ways. Some groups have attempted to minimize or deny the reality of the Nazi genocide, claiming that victim numbers were exaggerated or that the extermination camps never existed. These denialist movements, although marginal, have found receptive audiences in certain sectors of society, especially among those who sympathize with extreme right-wing ideologies or who seek to rehabilitate the image of the Third Reich. The fight against denialism has become a major concern for historians, educators, and survivors. Eisenhower's insistence on exhaustively documenting the camps and creating as many witnesses as possible proved to be extraordinarily prescient. The photographs, films, and testimonies collected during the liberation provide irrefutable evidence against the claims of those who deny the reality of the genocide. And the testimonies of the American veterans who participated in the liberation add an extra layer of credibility, since these soldiers had no personal interest in exaggerating what they had seen. Why do some people refuse to accept the reality of the Nazi genocide despite the overwhelming historical evidence? What ideological or psychological motivations drive denialism? And how should we respond as a society to those who attempt to distort or deny the history of one of the greatest atrocities committed by human beings against their fellow men? These questions lead us to reflect on the nature of historical memory and on our collective responsibility to preserve and transmit the lessons of the past. The memory of the Nazi genocide is not simply a matter of historical interest. It is an issue of vital importance for the present and the future. As long as forces exist that promote hatred, discrimination, and dehumanization, the history of what happened in the Nazi concentration camps will remain relevant as a warning and as a call to vigilance. The preservation of this memory has been institutionalized in various ways over the decades following the war. Museums and memorials dedicated to the genocide have been established in numerous countries, including the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, the Museum of the History of the Holocaust at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and the memorials at the sites of the concentration camps themselves. These spaces fulfill multiple functions. They preserve historical artifacts and documents, provide educational context, honor the victims, and create spaces for reflection and remembrance. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, inaugurated in 1993, represents one of the most ambitious efforts to preserve and transmit the memory of the Nazi genocide. Located on the National Mall in Washington, near the most emblematic monuments of the American nation, the museum receives more than 1 million visitors every year. Its permanent collection includes thousands of authentic objects from the concentration camps, from prisoner uniforms, to piles of confiscated shoes, from Nazi administrative documents, to videotaped testimonies of survivors. One of the most powerful aspects of the museum is its architectural design, conceived to create an immersive experience that goes beyond the simple transmission of information. Visitors are guided through a chronological narrative that begins with the rise of Nazism and culminates in the liberation of the camps. But the tour also includes spaces for reflection and emotional confrontation that seek to make the human impact of the historical events tangible. The role of the liberating veterans in these memory efforts has been significant. Many of them have participated as volunteers in museums and memorials, sharing their stories with visitors and providing a direct connection to the events being commemorated. Some have donated objects they kept from the time of the liberation, photographs taken with personal cameras, diaries written during those days, even artifacts collected in the camps that they had kept for decades as testimony to what they had witnessed. The veteran Robert Gruber, who had participated in the liberation of Ohrdruf as part of the initial reconnaissance patrol, donated to the Holocaust Museum a small Kodak camera with which he had taken photographs of the camp in the days following the liberation. The images, developed and preserved for more than 50 years, provide an intimate and personal perspective on the discovery of the camp, complementing the official photographs taken by military documentation teams. But the preservation of memory does not depend solely on formal institutions. The families of survivors and liberators have played a crucial role in passing down the stories from generation to generation. Children and grandchildren of survivors have grown up listening to the tales of their parents and grandparents, absorbing the lessons and traumas of a history they did not live directly, but that has deeply marked their identities. Some of these descendants have in turn become educators and activists, assuming the responsibility of continuing the testimony when their elders can no longer do so. This phenomenon of intergenerational transmission of trauma and memory has been the subject of numerous psychological and sociological studies. Researchers have documented what some call transgenerational trauma, the way in which the traumatic experiences of one generation can affect the psychology and behaviour of subsequent generations. even when they did not directly live the original events. The children of genocide survivors show, in some studies, higher rates of anxiety, depression, and other mental health problems, suggesting that the impact of trauma can extend beyond those who experienced it firsthand. But intergenerational transmission is not only of trauma, it is also of resilience, of values, of commitment to justice and memory. Many descendants of survivors describe feeling a special obligation to lead meaningful lives, to contribute to the world in ways that somehow justify the survival of their ancestors when so many others perished. This sense of responsibility has driven some toward careers in human rights, education, medicine, and other fields, where they can make positive contributions to humanity. What does the memory of what happened in the Nazi concentration camps over 80 years ago mean for us, as a contemporary society? What responsibilities do we have toward the survivors who are still living, increasingly fewer as time passes? And what lessons should we draw from this history to face the challenges of the present, from the resurgence of extreme nationalist movements to the new genocides that have occurred in various parts of the world? These questions confront us with the contemporary relevance of a history that might seem distant, but that continues to have profound implications for our current world. Because the Nazi concentration camps were not an inexplicable aberration, an outbreak of collective madness, without connection to the broader trends of modern civilization. They were, on the contrary, the result of comprehensible historical processes, the rise of extreme nationalism, the gradual dehumanization of minority groups, the erosion of democratic institutions, the exploitation of fear and resentment for political ends. Understanding these processes is essential for recognizing the warning signs when they appear in our own time. Genocide scholars have identified common patterns that preceded mass atrocities: the classification of human groups into hierarchical categories, the symbolization that marks certain groups as different or inferior, the institutionalized discrimination that deprives these groups of rights and resources, the dehumanization that depicts them as animals, parasites, or diseases, the organization of forces capable of carrying out mass violence, the polarization of society into opposed groups, the preparation of perpetrators through training and indoctrination, the systematic persecution that includes segregation, deportation, and violence, and finally the extermination itself. This model, developed by historian Gregory Stanton, has been applied to analyse not only the Nazi genocide, but also other genocides of the 20th and 21st centuries, including the Armenian genocide, the genocide in Rwanda, ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, and crimes against humanity committed in various contemporary conflicts. The recognition of these patterns has informed the international community's efforts to prevent future genocides, albeit with mixed results. The creation of the International Criminal Court, which became operational in the year 2002, represents one of the most significant efforts to institutionalize the lessons of the Nuremberg trials. The court has jurisdiction to try individuals for crimes of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, establishing the principle that individual responsibility exists for these crimes that transcends national borders. Although the court has faced criticism and limitations, its existence represents an important advance in the development of international humanitarian law. But beyond international institutions, genocide prevention fundamentally depends on the vigilance of ordinary citizens, on the willingness to recognize and report warning signs when they appear, and on the collective rejection of ideologies of hatred and dehumanization. This is perhaps the most important lesson that the liberators of the camps wanted to transmit to future generations, that the atrocities they witnessed were possible because too many people remained silent, because too many people looked the other way, because too many people allowed hatred to grow unopposed until it was too late to stop it. The veteran Harry Snodgrass, the military chaplain who administered to the survivors of Dachau, dedicated the rest of his life to promoting interfaith dialogue and understanding between different communities. In one of his last interviews before his death, Snodgrass reflected on what he had learned in the camps and on the message that he wanted to leave for future generations. What I saw in Dachau taught me that evil prospers when good people remain silent, he said. It is not enough to not participate actively in injustice. We have the obligation to oppose it, to speak out against it, to act to stop it. Every time we see someone being mistreated for their religion, their race, their origin, their identity, and we do nothing, we are allowing hatred to grow. And if hatred grows enough, far enough, deep enough, it can lead to places none of us wants to imagine. This message of active moral responsibility, of commitment to justice and human rights, is the most enduring legacy of the liberation of the Nazi concentration camps. The soldiers who crossed those gates in April and May 1945 became witnesses to what human beings are capable of doing to one another when hatred becomes state policy. But they also became bearers of an obligation, the obligation to testify, to remember, and to ensure that future generations never forget what happened. As we write these words, the last survivors and liberators of the camps are disappearing. With each passing year, more voices are silenced, more direct testimonies are lost forever. Soon, very soon, there will be no one left who can say, I was there, I saw it with my own eyes. When that moment arrives, the responsibility to preserve and transmit this memory will pass completely to the generations that did not live those events, but who must, nevertheless, bear the weight of remembering them. Are we prepared to assume that responsibility? Have we learned the lessons that the survivors and liberators wanted to teach us? And will we be capable of recognizing and stopping the forces of hatred and dehumanization when they appear in our own time, in our own communities, perhaps even in our own hearts? Let us return now to those days of April 1945, when American soldiers continued their advance through German territory, discovering camp after camp, atrocity after atrocity. Because the story we are telling does not end with the liberation of Dachau or Mauthausen. There are more camps to discover, more victims to find, more testimonies to collect. While American forces advanced towards the south of Germany, other units were heading in different directions, each one finding its own camps, its own victims, its own particular horrors. The Nazi concentration camp system was so vast, so spread across all occupied Europe, that it seemed there was no corner of the continent that had not been touched by its shadow. In northern Germany, British forces liberated the Bergen-Belsen camp on the 15th of April 1945. What they found there represented perhaps the most devastating image of the entire liberation of the camps, an image that would become a symbol of the Nazi genocide and that would shake the entire world. Bergen-Belsen had begun as a prisoner of war camp and had later become an exchange camp, where Jews were held whom the Nazis hoped to exchange for Germans detained abroad or for money. But in the final months of the war, as the Nazi concentration camp system began to collapse under the pressure of Allied advances, Bergen-Belsen was transformed into an evacuation destination for prisoners from other camps. Tens of thousands of prisoners were transferred to Bergen-Belsen during the first months of 1945, arriving in already weakened conditions after the brutal death marches. The camp, which was not designed to house so many people, became a hell of overcrowding, disease, and death. Food and water supplies ran out, sanitary facilities collapsed completely, and epidemics of typhus and other diseases spread uncontrollably. By the time the British soldiers arrived, Bergen-Belsen had become an open-air cemetery. Approximately 60,000 prisoners remained in the camp, but thousands more lay dead everywhere, their bodies abandoned where they had fallen because there was no one left with the strength to bury them. The barracks were full of corpses mixed with the living, some of the latter so weakened that they could barely be distinguished from the dead surrounding them. The photographs and films taken in Bergen-Belsen during and after the liberation became some of the most iconic and disturbing images of the Second World War. The bulldozers pushing mountains of bodies into mass graves, the British soldiers with gas masks, trying to manage the health crisis, the skeletal survivors staring at the cameras, with eyes that seemed to have seen too much to ever be able to forget. These images were widely broadcast in newsreels worldwide, confronting civilian audiences with the reality of what had occurred in Europe. Among the thousands of victims of Bergen-Belsen were 2 German girls of Jewish origin, whose diary would become one of the most read and known testimonies of the Nazi genocide, Anne Frank and her sister Margot. The Frank sisters had been deported to Auschwitz in September 1944, along with their family, after being discovered in the hideout where they had remained hidden for more than 2 years in Amsterdam. From Auschwitz, Anne and Margot were transferred to Bergen-Belsen, where both died of typhus probably in February or March 1945, just weeks before the camp was liberated. The diary of Anne Frank, preserved by Miep Geers, one of the people who had helped hide the family, was published for the first time in 1947 and has since become one of the most translated and read books in the world. Through its pages, readers of all ages and cultures have been able to connect with the experience of the Nazi genocide through the voice of an intelligent, hopeful, and deeply human teenager. The death of Anne in Bergen-Belsen, so close to liberation, represents one of the most moving tragedies of the entire war. But Bergen-Belsen, although liberated by British forces and not American, had a significant impact on the American perception of the Nazi genocide as well. The news and images of Bergen-Belsen reached the United States at almost the same time as the news from Buchenwald and Dachau, creating a cascade of revelations that confronted the American public with the full scale of Nazi crimes. The impact of these revelations on American public opinion was profound. Polls taken in the weeks following the liberation of the camps showed that the majority of Americans now believed that the Nazi government had deliberately murdered millions of innocent civilians, something many had been skeptical to believe when the first reports arrived during the war. The images of the camps provided irrefutable visual evidence that dispelled any residual doubt about the nature of the Nazi regime. This transformation in public perception had significant political consequences. Support for the prosecution of Nazi war criminals increased considerably, and there was growing pressure for full justice to be done for the atrocities committed. Support for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine also increased, as many Americans felt that the survivors of the genocide deserved a safe haven where they could rebuild their lives. Although the issues related to the establishment of Israel were complex and controversial, the liberation of the camps helped create a climate of opinion more favorable to Jewish aspirations. In Europe, meanwhile, the liberation of the camps raised immediate and urgent questions about what to do with the hundreds of thousands of survivors who now found themselves in Allied territory. Many of them had no homes to return to, their communities had been destroyed, their properties confiscated, their families murdered. Others feared returning to countries where anti-Semitic sentiment still existed, especially in Eastern Europe, where some survivors who tried to return were met with hostility and even violence. The initial response was to establish displaced persons camps, where survivors could receive medical attention, food, and shelter, while their future was determined. These camps, some of them ironically located in the exact same facilities that had served as Nazi concentration camps, housed hundreds of thousands of people for years after the end of the war. The conditions in many of these camps were precarious, and some survivors described the experience of living in them as a continuation of their captivity, although now under Allied control instead of Nazi. The American journalist Earl Harrison was sent by President Harry Truman in the summer of 1945 to investigate the conditions in the displaced persons camps. His report, published in September of that year, was devastating. Harrison described conditions of overcrowding, inadequate food, and treatment that, in his words, made it appear that the Allies were treating the Jews in the same manner as the Nazis, except that they were not exterminating them. The report provoked public outrage and led to significant improvements in camp conditions, although the fundamental problems of what to do with the survivors in the long term remained unresolved for years. What options did these survivors have who had lost everything? Where could they go when their homes no longer existed and their countries of origin rejected them? And what responsibility did the Allied nations have, who had liberated the camps but now faced the reality of hundreds of thousands of stateless people with no clear future? The answer to these questions involved years of diplomatic negotiations, political debates, and individual decisions by survivors attempting to rebuild their devastated lives. Some emigrated to the United States, taking advantage of special programs established to admit refugees from Nazism. Others headed to Palestine, legally or illegally, contributing to the demographic pressure that would eventually lead to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. Others remained in Europe, trying to rebuild Jewish communities that had been almost completely annihilated. For the American soldiers who had liberated the camps, the immediate task of attending to the survivors posed challenges both practical and emotional. Military doctors and nurses found themselves treating medical conditions that many had never seen before. Extreme cases of malnutrition, epidemic diseases spread in overcrowded conditions, physical injuries caused by years of abuse, and profound psychological trauma that manifested in varied and often bewildering ways. One of the most disturbing medical discoveries was that some survivors died after receiving normal food. Their bodies, after years of starvation, had lost the capacity to process normal quantities of food, and the ingestion of rich foods could cause what doctors called refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal condition. Medical teams had to develop special protocols to gradually feed the survivors, starting with small amounts of easily digestible foods and slowly increasing as their digestive systems recovered. Lieutenant Dr. Felix Gruber, the military physician who had attended to the survivors of Ohrdruf, described years later the moral dilemma faced by the medical teams. We had these people who had survived the worst that human beings can inflict on one another, who had reached the brink of death and somehow clung to life, and now they were with us, looking at us with eyes pleading for help. And sometimes the only thing we could give them was a spoonful of watery soup, because anything else that would have killed them. It was incredibly frustrating, incredibly painful to see their disappointment when we explained that we couldn't give them the food they craved so much. But beyond the medical challenges, the soldiers also faced the challenge of communication. Many survivors did not speak English, and the American soldiers rarely spoke the languages of Central and Eastern Europe, from where the majority of the prisoners originated: Polish, Hungarian, Czech, Russian, Yiddish. Communication was often reduced to gestures, to looks, to a body language that transcended linguistic barriers. Some American Jewish soldiers who spoke Yiddish, the common language of Eastern European Jews, played a crucial role as interpreters and cultural mediators. For these soldiers, the experience of the camps had an additional dimension of personal significance. Many of them had family members in Europe whom they had not been able to contact during the war, and the liberation of the camps often brought confirmation of their worst fears: grandparents, cousins, aunts and uncles who had been murdered in the genocide. Sergeant Meyer Birnbaum, a Jewish soldier from Brooklyn who served as an interpreter in Buchenwald, described the experience of searching for his own family members among the survivors. My grandmother had emigrated to the United States before the First World War, but she left behind 2 sisters and their families in Poland. Throughout the entire war, we tried to get information about them, but we couldn't find out anything. When I arrived in Buchenwald and saw all those survivors, I began to ask if anyone knew the Goldstein family from Lodz. I asked everyone I met. Nobody knew them. Later, I found out that the entire family had been murdered in Treblinka in 1942. Stories like Birnbaum's were repeated among the American Jewish soldiers who participated in the liberation of the camps. For them, the war against Nazi Germany was not just a patriotic obligation, but a deeply personal struggle against a regime that had attempted to exterminate their people. The liberation of the camps provided them with direct evidence of what they had been fighting for: but also confirmation of the devastating losses their communities had suffered. This personal dimension profoundly affected many of these Jewish soldiers, some of whom decided to remain in Europe after the war to help the survivors. Some involved themselves in organizations that helped refugees emigrate to Palestine, often in defiance of British restrictions on Jewish immigration. Others worked in the displaced persons camps, providing social assistance, education, and emotional support to survivors trying to rebuild their lives. Soldier Leonard Bernstein, a young musician from Massachusetts who would later become one of the most famous orchestra conductors in the world, visited several displaced persons camps in the months following the war, organizing concerts for survivors and helping to reunite Jewish musicians who had survived the genocide. Music, which had been an important part of Jewish cultural life before the war, became a means of reconnecting with traditions that the Nazis had tried to destroy, and a form of affirming human life and creativity after years of death and destruction. These efforts of cultural reconstruction represented an important response to the devastation of the genocide. The Nazis had not only murdered millions of people, they had attempted to destroy entire cultures, languages, religious traditions, ways of life that had existed for centuries. The recovery of these cultures, although it could never be complete, became a form of retroactive resistance, an affirmation that the Nazi attempt at total annihilation had failed. In the years and decades following the war, Jewish communities around the world undertook systematic efforts to document and preserve what had been lost. Research projects reconstructed the history of communities that had been completely destroyed, utilizing survivor testimonies, municipal archives, family photographs, and any other material that had survived. These efforts produced thousands of memory books, Yizkor books in Yiddish, which documented the life of individual Jewish communities prior to their destruction. But while these documentation and preservation efforts continued, the world moved on, and the memories of what had happened in the camps began to transform from lived experience into history. The generation of survivors and liberators was aging, and with each passing decade, the events of 1945 drifted further back in time, becoming something read in history books rather than something personally experienced. This process of historicization posed new challenges for the preservation of memory. How to keep the emotional impact of the events alive when there were no longer direct witnesses to tell their stories. How to transmit the reality of the suffering to generations that had grown up in peace and prosperity, who could not easily imagine the conditions that had existed in the camps, and how to prevent the history of the genocide from turning into an abstraction, into a series of numbers and dates devoid of humanity. Educators and activists developed various strategies to address these challenges. Educational programs brought students to visit the sites of the former concentration camps, allowing them to physically experience the places where the atrocities had occurred. Videotaped testimonies of survivors were incorporated into school curricula, providing a personal connection to historical events, and works of art, literature, and cinema continued to explore the theme of the genocide, seeking new ways to transmit its meaning to contemporary audiences. The film Schindler's List, directed by Steven Spielberg and released in 1993, represented one of the most significant efforts to bring the history of the Nazi genocide to mass audiences. Based on the true story of Oskar Schindler, a German businessman who saved more than 1,000 Jews by employing them in his factories, the film was seen by millions of people worldwide and won numerous awards, including the Oscar for Best Picture. Its success demonstrated that there was a broad public interested in confronting this difficult history, and it contributed to a renewed interest in genocide education. Spielberg, deeply affected by the experience of filming the movie in the actual locations where the genocide had occurred, used the profits from the film to establish the Shoah Foundation, dedicated to collecting and preserving survivor testimonies. The foundation has collected more than 55,000 testimonies in over 65 languages, creating an unprecedented archive of individual experiences of the genocide. These testimonies, now accessible through digital platforms, allow students and researchers around the world to directly hear the voices of those who lived these events. What does it mean to hear the voice of a survivor telling their story? What impact does this personal contact have, even if mediated by technology, compared to reading a history book or watching a documentary? And how can we ensure that these voices continue to be heard when the survivors themselves are no longer here to speak? These questions lead us back to the responsibility of present and future generations. The memory of the Nazi genocide will not preserve itself. It requires active and continuous efforts of education, documentation, and transmission. And it requires, above all, the willingness to confront a painful and difficult history, to learn the lessons it offers, and to apply those lessons to the challenges of our own time. Let us return once more to those spring days of 1945, when the war in Europe was drawing to a close and American soldiers continued uncovering the evidence of Nazi crimes. Because there are more stories to tell, more camps to visit, more testimonies to collect. On the 29th of April 1945, the exact same day that American forces were liberating Dachau, other army units arrived at a sub-camp called Kaufering, part of the Dachau system, located about 50 kilometers southwest of the main camp. What they found there added new dimensions to the panorama of suffering they were discovering. Kaufering was actually a complex of 11 sub-camps established in 1944 to provide slave labour for the construction of a gigantic underground fighter plane factory. The Nazis, facing increasingly intense Allied bombings, had decided to relocate their armaments production to underground facilities that would be protected from air attacks. To build these facilities, they utilised thousands of concentration camp prisoners, primarily Hungarian Jews, deported to Auschwitz and then transferred to Kaufering. The conditions in the Kaufering sub-camps were particularly brutal, even compared to other camps in the concentration camp system. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts, excavating tunnels and mixing cement, fed with rations that barely sufficed to keep them alive. Housing consisted of semi-covered shelters dug into the earth, without adequate heating or protection from the elements. During the winter of 1944 to 1945, thousands of prisoners died of exposure, disease, and exhaustion. When the American forces approached Kaufering, the SS guards attempted to eliminate the evidence of their crimes. In one of the subcamps, they gathered the sick prisoners into a barrack and set it on fire, burning alive hundreds of people who were too weak to escape. The American soldiers who arrived shortly after found the charred remains of this crime, along with survivors who had managed to escape the flames and who were now wandering the surroundings in a state of shock. Lieutenant William Walsh, one of the first American officers to arrive at Kaufering, left a written testimony of what he found. According to his account, the smell of burnt flesh was perceptible from miles away, and when the soldiers arrived at the camp, they found scenes that defied all description. The barracks that had not been burned were full of bodies in various states of decomposition, mixed with survivors who could barely move. Some of these survivors had survived by feeding on the bodies of their dead comrades, a revelation that profoundly shocked the soldiers who found them. What drives a human being to such extremes of desperation? What does it mean for our understanding of human nature that ordinary people, in extraordinary circumstances, can be reduced to behaviours that we would normally consider unimaginable? And how do we morally process the survival actions of people who had no other option but to cling to life by whatever means available? These disturbing questions arose repeatedly during the liberation of the camps, confronting the American soldiers with the limits of human experience. Many of them had grown up with clear ideas about good and evil, about acceptable and unacceptable behaviours. But what they found in the camps defied these simple categories, showing how extreme circumstances can completely transform an individual's moral frame of reference. Viktor Frankl, the surviving psychiatrist from Auschwitz, reflected extensively on these questions in his later writings. He observed that in the camps, conventional moral categories lost much of their meaning. In the concentration camp, he wrote, The average prisoner paid no attention to things that might be called moral. When life itself is at stake, when death threatens at every moment, conventional moral considerations become secondary, even irrelevant. The instinct for survival takes control. But Frankl also observed that even in the most extreme circumstances, some prisoners maintained a core of dignity and moral principles. There is always a choice, he wrote. Even when everything has been taken from you, you still have the freedom to choose your attitude toward your situation. I saw prisoners who shared their last piece of bread with others, who comforted other dying men, who chose to maintain their humanity, even when everything around them told them that humanity was worthless. These individuals demonstrated that even in the most extreme circumstances, there exists a choice, an ability to decide who we want to be. This observation by Frankl resonated deeply with many of the American soldiers who liberated the camps. Amidst the absolute degradation they witnessed, they also bore witness to acts of extraordinary kindness among the prisoners, survivors who shared their meagre rations with others even weaker, who cared for the sick despite their own exhaustion, who kept hope alive through the telling of stories, the recitation of prayers, or simply human contact. Sergeant William Craft, who participated in the liberation of one of the Dachau subcamps, would recall years later a moment that marked him profoundly. Among the survivors, he found an old man who could barely stand, his body reduced to little more than bones covered in skin. But this old man, upon seeing the American soldiers, began to sing with a trembling voice, a song in a language that Craft did not understand. Other survivors gradually joined in the singing, their weak but determined voices rising into the air, contaminated by the smell of death. Craft later asked an interpreter what song that was. He was told that it was a Jewish religious hymn, an affirmation of faith that the prisoners had sung in secret during years of captivity, risking brutal punishments if the guards discovered them. The fact that these survivors, after everything they had suffered, chose to celebrate their liberation with an act of faith and hope, rather than hatred or despair, left an indelible impression on Craft and on many other soldiers who witnessed similar scenes. How was it possible that people who had experienced the worst of human nature retained the capacity to believe in something transcendent? What internal resources allowed them to keep a flame of hope alive when everything around them was darkness? And what could these experiences of extreme resilience teach those who had never faced such trials? These philosophical and spiritual questions inevitably emerge from the experiences of liberation, posing profound challenges to the prior conceptions that both survivors and liberators held about human nature, about good and evil, about the meaning of existence itself. For many, the answers they found would permanently transform their lives and their worldviews. But let us return to the concrete ground of historical events, because the story of the liberation of the Nazi camps is far from complete. As American forces processed the horrors of Dachau, Buchenwald, and the other camps they had discovered, the war was finally reaching its conclusion, and new challenges were emerging for liberators and survivors alike. On the 30th of April 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin, while Soviet forces closed the ring on the German capital. A week later, on the 7th of May, representatives of the German High Command signed the unconditional surrender in Reims, France. The war in Europe had officially ended, although in many parts of the continent confusion and chaos would continue for weeks and months. For the soldiers who had liberated the camps, the end of the war brought a relief mixed with a sense of emptiness and disorientation. They had fought for months or years, with a clear objective: to defeat the Nazi enemy. Now that objective had been accomplished, but what they had discovered in the camps had shown them that military victory, while necessary, was not enough to restore the moral order of the world. How could one declare victory after witnessing such devastation of humanity? General Eisenhower, aware of the psychological impact that the liberation of the camps was causing his troops, ordered that additional support be provided to the most affected soldiers. But in 1945, understanding of psychological trauma was limited and available resources were scarce. Many soldiers were simply sent home with the expectation that they would seamlessly reintegrate into civilian life, without recognition of the invisible scars they carried. The repatriation process of the American troops began relatively quickly after the end of the war, but thousands of soldiers remained in Europe for months or even years, participating in the tasks of occupation, denazification, and administration of the displaced persons camps. These soldiers continued facing the consequences of the Nazi genocide on a daily basis, helping survivors, searching for war criminals, and documenting evidence for the upcoming trials. Among the most emotionally difficult tasks was that of helping survivors search for information about missing relatives. Organizations such as the International Tracing Service of the Red Cross established offices in the displaced persons camps, compiling lists of survivors and attempting to reunite families separated by the war. But for the vast majority of the survivors, the searches ended in confirmation of what they already feared. Their loved ones had been murdered. Soldier Erwin Heimann, an American Jewish officer, who was assigned to administer the Landsberg displaced persons camp in Bavaria, left a detailed record of his experiences in letters sent to his wife during the months he spent on that assignment. These letters, later published as a book, provide an intimate view of the challenges faced by both the administrators and the residents of these camps. Heimann described the frustration of trying to provide decent living conditions with limited resources, the complexity of mediating between different groups of survivors with diverse needs and expectations, and the pain of witnessing daily the suffering of people who had survived the Nazi camps, only to find themselves now in a sort of limbo, waiting for an uncertain future. He also described moments of joy and hope, weddings celebrated in the camp between survivors who had found new partners, births of babies that represented the continuity of life, and the gradual rebuilding of community institutions like schools, synagogues, and newspapers. The population of the displaced persons camps was extraordinarily diverse, including concentration camp survivors, refugees who had escaped from territories now under Soviet control, and people who had simply lost their homes during the war. This diversity created administrative tensions and challenges, but also opportunities for cultural exchange and solidarity among people who shared experiences of loss and displacement. A notable phenomenon that emerged in the displaced persons camps was the flourishing of cultural and educational activity. Despite the difficult conditions, the survivors established schools for children and adults, published newspapers and magazines, organised theatrical performances and concerts, and documented their experiences through writing and art. This cultural effervescence represented an affirmation of life and creativity after years of destruction, a rejection of the dehumanization that the Nazis had tried to impose. Why was it so important for these survivors to dedicate energy to culture and education when they still faced uncertainty about their most basic future? What profound human need did these activities satisfy that went beyond the material needs of food and shelter? And what does this tell us about the nature of the human spirit and its capacity to transcend the most adverse circumstances? The answer, according to many survivors and scholars of the period, is that the cultural activity represented a reclamation of the identity and dignity that the Nazis had attempted to destroy. During the years of persecution, Jews and other groups had been stripped not only of their properties and freedoms, but of their cultural identity, of their right to practice their traditions, speak their languages, and transmit their heritage to the following generations. The cultural reconstruction in the displaced persons camps was, in a sense, an act of retroactive resistance, a declaration that the Nazi attempt at cultural annihilation had failed. This cultural dimension of recovery was particularly significant for the preservation of Yiddish, the language that had been spoken by millions of Jews in Eastern Europe before the war. The Nazi genocide had destroyed the communities where Yiddish was the everyday language, killing the majority of its native speakers. The survivors in the displaced persons camps, conscious that they were the last guardians of this linguistic and cultural tradition, made deliberate efforts to preserve and transmit Yiddish through publications, theatre, and education. The Yiddish newspapers that were published in the displaced persons camps provide a fascinating window into the mentality and concerns of the survivors in those years. Their pages included news about the search for relatives, debates about the future destination of the survivors, reflections on the meaning of the genocide, and also poetry, fiction, and humour, affirming that life continued even after the most absolute disaster. One of the most significant poets to emerge from this experience was Abraham Sutzkever, who had survived the Vilna Ghetto and had witnessed the destruction of one of the most vibrant Jewish communities in Eastern Europe. Sutzkever wrote poetry in Yiddish that attempted to capture both the suffering of the destruction and the will for survival and reconstruction. His verses, read in gatherings of survivors and published in the camp magazines, provided artistic expression to experiences that seemed to be beyond words. But while culture flourished in the displaced persons camps, the political tensions of the post-war world began to affect the fate of the survivors. The growing rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, which would soon become the Cold War, complicated the issues of repatriation and resettlement. Many survivors came from territories that were now under Soviet control, and they feared returning to countries where anti-Semitism persisted and where communist regimes might persecute them for other reasons. The question of Palestine became the main focus of the debate over the future of the Jewish survivors. Many of them desired to emigrate to the land they considered their ancestral home, where they hoped to build new lives in a Jewish society. But Palestine was under British mandate, and the British government, facing pressure from Arab countries and concerned about regional stability, maintained strict restrictions on Jewish immigration. This British policy generated frustration and resentment among the genocide survivors, who felt that after everything they had suffered, they were being denied the right to find refuge in the only place that they wanted to live. Some attempted to emigrate illegally to Palestine, organised by Zionist movements that operated clandestine transport networks. The British intercepted many of these ships and sent the passengers to detention camps in Cyprus, creating situations that critics bitterly compared to the treatment the survivors had received from the Nazis. The most famous case was that of the ship Exodus in 1947, which carried more than 4,500 genocide survivors toward Palestine. The British intercepted the ship near the Palestinian coast, and in a decision that generated international condemnation, returned the passengers to Germany, forcing them to disembark in the very country where they had been persecuted. The images of survivors being forced off the ship in Hamburg provoked global outrage and contributed to the international pressure that would eventually lead to the end of the British mandate and the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. For the American soldiers who had liberated the camps and who now witnessed these political struggles, the situation was profoundly frustrating. They had risked their lives to defeat Nazism and liberate the victims of the genocide, only to see how those same victims continued to face obstacles and suffering in the post-war world. Some soldiers became personally involved in efforts to help survivors emigrate, even when this meant acting against the official policies of their own governments or allied governments. What moral obligations arise from the experience of witnessing mass atrocities? When is it legitimate to defy official laws and policies in the name of higher humanitarian imperatives? And how do we balance the demands of justice with the complexities of international politics? These questions, sharply posed by the circumstances of the post-war period, would continue to be debated for decades and would remain relevant in subsequent humanitarian conflicts. The experience of the Nazi genocide survivors and of those who tried to help them provided important lessons about the limitations of the international community to respond to humanitarian crises, lessons that unfortunately were not always applied in later situations. The creation of the State of Israel in May 1948 represented a moment of enormous significance for the survivors of the genocide. For many, it was the realization of a dream that had seemed impossible during the darkest years of the war, an affirmation that the Jewish people had not been destroyed and that they could build their own future in their own land. Thousands of survivors emigrated to Israel in the following years, contributing to the construction of a new society, while carrying with them the memories and traumas of what they had lived. But the creation of Israel also had complex and controversial consequences, including the displacement of the Palestinian Arab population and the beginning of a conflict that continues to this day. The relationship between the memory of the Nazi genocide and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been the subject of intense debates, with different perspectives on how the history of Jewish suffering should inform the policies of the State of Israel towards other peoples. For the American veterans who had liberated the camps, these later developments often seemed distant from their own experiences. The majority of them returned to the United States, resumed their civilian lives, and focused on building careers, raising families, and participating in the prosperity of the post-war United States. But the memories of what they had seen in the camps accompanied them, emerging in unexpected moments, affecting their relationships and their perceptions of the world in ways that they often could not fully articulate. The veteran Harold Gruber, who had participated in the liberation of Buchenwald, described in an interview conducted decades after the war how the memories of the camp had affected his daily life in subtle but persistent ways. For years, I couldn't waste food, he said. Every time I saw someone throw food away, I thought of the Buchenwald survivors, of how they would have given anything for a piece of bread. My wife thought I was eccentric, but I couldn't explain to her why it affected me so much. Not even I completely understood it. Other veterans described similar experiences, difficulty enjoying celebrations or festivities, feelings of guilt for the comforts of American life, inability to relate to people who had not seen what they had seen. Some found solace in the company of other veterans who had shared similar experiences, forming informal groups where they could talk about things they couldn't discuss with their civilian families or friends. Formal recognition of the veterans' psychological trauma would come gradually over the following decades. The concept of post-traumatic stress disorder was developed and formalized primarily in response to the experiences of Vietnam War veterans, but it was retrospectively applied as well to veterans of previous wars, including those who had participated in the liberation of the Nazi camps. This recognition allowed some veterans to finally receive treatment and support for traumas they had carried in silence for decades. But beyond the clinical aspects of trauma, many veterans also experienced deeper transformations in their worldviews and values. The confrontation with extreme evil had forced them to reconsider fundamental questions about human nature, about the meaning of morality, about individual responsibility in the face of collective injustice. The veteran George Gruber, no relation to the other veterans mentioned with the same last name, expressed this transformation eloquently in an interview. Before Dachau, I was a typical American kid. I believed the world was basically good, that people were fundamentally decent, that civilization was advancing toward progress. Dachau destroyed all those illusions. It showed me that human beings are capable of a cruelty I had never imagined possible. But it also showed me something else, that even in the most extreme circumstances, some individuals choose goodness, choose compassion, choose to maintain their humanity, and that, somehow, was even more important than the evidence of evil. This dialectic between the recognition of evil and the affirmation of human goodness became a central theme in the testimonies of many liberating veterans, as well as in the testimonies of the survivors themselves. The experience of the genocide had revealed both the worst and the best of what human beings are capable of, and the task for subsequent generations was to learn from both dimensions. Let us return now to the direct testimonies of the survivors, because their voices are fundamental to fully understanding the significance of what the American soldiers discovered in those days of April and May 1945. The survivors who were liberated by the American forces left records of their experiences that complement and deepen the testimonies of the liberators. One survivor named Raina Bernstein, who was separated from her parents at the age of 4 and sent to hide in a remote forest in Poland, described decades later how the experience of the genocide had permanently affected her capacity to feel emotions. To survive, I had to cut off my feelings completely, she recounted. It was intolerable and impossible to continue living with the kind of feelings I was having. Abandonment. To survive, I had to cut off my feelings and live a fantasy. Bernstein described the experience of total isolation during the years she spent hidden in the forest. I felt totally isolated from humanity, from human beings, she recalled. I spent half my life there. I was 4 years old, and I spent the next 2 years there. That is half the time I had been alive without real contact, without contact with people. This description evokes the suffering, not only physical but also psychological and emotional, that the survivors experienced, a suffering that would continue to affect them for the rest of their lives. The experience of emotional desensitization that Bernstein described was common among many survivors. Testimonies collected by organizations like the Shoah Foundation reveal consistent patterns of psychological response to the extreme trauma of the genocide. Many survivors described how constant exposure to death and suffering led them to develop defense mechanisms that allowed them to continue functioning day to day. A survivor named Manya Altman described this desensitization in her testimony. When the interviewer asked her how she managed the death of acquaintances in the ghetto, Manya replied, "You saw death every day on the street. Old people, children dying. You didn't pay attention. You just wanted to survive yourself." She made a meaningful pause and looked directly at the interviewer. "You get used to this, you know." But this desensitization coexisted with an indomitable will to survive, a persistence that many survivors attributed to their youth and their desire to see the defeat of their persecutors. Fela Abramowitz, another survivor interviewed by the Shoah Foundation, recalled her thoughts during those years. "I am 18 years old. You know, I want to live. I mean, how could the world exist without me? I want to be part of it. And most importantly, I want to see the Germans defeated. That was the most important motivation." How did these young people maintain hope in such desperate circumstances? What internal resources allowed them to imagine a future when the present seemed to offer only death and suffering? And what happened to that hope when the liberation they had yearned for so long finally arrived? The answer to this last question turns out to be more complex than one might expect. Contrary to the popularized image of liberation as a moment of unequivocal joy, survivors' testimonies reveal a much more complicated range of emotional responses. For many survivors, the liberation brought not only relief, but also a profound uncertainty about the future and an inability to completely process what had occurred. One survivor named Erno described his feelings at the moment of liberation, with frequent pauses and evident hesitation. "Well, I felt it was something great. I am a survivor of possibly the only survivor of the family, and it's a great opportunity where I just felt lost. I didn't know what was going to happen." Gloria Abrams, another survivor whose testimony was collected by the Shoah Foundation, expressed similar feelings of ambivalence regarding the liberation. "We were alive, so we were glad to survive. But there were still difficulties because I was still young, and there was nobody to take care of us. We had nowhere to go, what to eat." She shrugged her shoulders while speaking. "It was horrible." These descriptions of liberation contrast sharply with the cinematic representations of smiling soldiers being embraced by grateful survivors. The reality was much more nuanced. The survivors were physically devastated, psychologically traumatized, and faced a completely uncertain future. The joy of survival coexisted with the mourning for the lost, the fear of the future, and a profound sense of disorientation. Joan, a survivor who was hidden during the war and whose testimony was collected in a program about the psychological impact of the genocide, eloquently described this complexity. I survived without anyone. Not only did I survive without anyone, my identity was taken from me. I was told I couldn't be who I was. I had to be a new person, so I was surviving as a new person. And the old person, the little girl, the Jewish girl, even though you survive physically, emotionally, you barely survive. This observation about emotional survival versus physical survival illuminates a dimension of the genocide that the American liberators could only partially understand at the moment of liberation. The soldiers could see the emaciated bodies, the physical evidence of abuse, the material conditions of the camps, but the invisible damage, the psychological trauma that would affect the survivors for the rest of their lives, was less evident, though equally devastating. Joan also revealed something profoundly disturbing about how society treated survivors after the war. When I came to this country, nobody ever asked me what happened to me during the war. I've been with therapists all my life. Not one of them ever asked me what happened to me during the war. It's as if those years didn't exist. This silence surrounding the experiences of the genocide reflected a broader tendency in post-war society to avoid confronting the traumas of the recent past directly. Both survivors and liberators often found that their audiences did not want to hear about what they had experienced, preferring to look forward instead of backward. This social silence contributed to the isolation of many survivors and veterans, leaving them alone with memories that seemed impossible to communicate. An American veteran whose story was shared in the same program illustrates how this pattern affected the liberators as well. A viewer wrote, "When I tried to record the story of my World War II veteran father, he was still traumatized by what he had seen. He and his unit liberated a concentration camp. 60 years later, he still couldn't talk about it because it was so horrific. Can you imagine carrying those horrors and that post-traumatic stress to the grave?" This observation about the trauma of the liberators complements the testimonies of the survivors, showing that the experience of the camps profoundly affected everyone who came into contact with it, whether as a victim or as a witness. The inability to speak about what had been seen, the burden of unprocessed trauma, was a shared experience that united, paradoxically, survivors and liberators in a community of silenced suffering. The survivor Ludwig Charotan, whose testimony was analysed in a study on coping strategies during and after the genocide, expressed this difficulty to speak. "To this day, I don't feel comfortable talking about the Holocaust voluntarily, specifically because I get too emotional." He then added, "It is not pleasant to talk about the Holocaust." However, Charotan also acknowledged that when he did choose to share his story, the experience had generally been rewarding and had helped him cope with life after the genocide. Charotan attributed several significant personal changes to his experience during the genocide. Once the Holocaust started, you become a different person instantly. He went from living a comfortable life in Poland as a spoiled child to living in constant fear and anxiety, simply trying to make it through the day and protect his family. As a result of the suffering during the war, Charotan frequently explained that he was forced to grow up overnight. This accelerated transformation from childhood to adulthood was a common experience among young survivors. Children who should have been playing, learning, growing up in safety, were forced to assume adult responsibilities, to develop survival skills, to witness atrocities that no child should ever see. This loss of childhood represented one of the most tragic dimensions of the genocide, a theft not only of lives, but of the possibilities for normal development that those lives should have contained. Hidden children like Josie, whose testimony was shared in the program on the psychological impact of the genocide, faced particular challenges. Josie described her experience in a convent where she was hidden. The nuns were when I got there, they were very, very strict. And I was 3 years old, and I think all I wanted was for them to hold me and kiss me and, tell me that everything would be okay. This basic need for affection and security, denied to so many children during the years of the genocide, left marks that lasted for decades. Josie recounted, "My mother tells me that when we reunited for the first time, I would tie my nightgown to hers because I was afraid of leaving. I was afraid of losing her." The analyst hosting the program noted that feeling of abandonment is still so raw for her, even decades later. Alfred, another survivor who was hidden during childhood, described how, as a child, he struggled with the constant feeling that there was no one he could completely trust. "Now, I was with families who fed me, but they weren't people I could confide in. They weren't people who knew I was Jewish. All around me was danger." Alfred found comfort in a small object that became his only friend during those years of concealment and fear. What does it mean for a child to grow up without the ability to trust the adults around them? How does this early experience affect their ability to form intimate relationships in adult life? And how are these patterns of mistrust and fear transmitted to subsequent generations? These questions about the intergenerational impact of trauma have been the subject of extensive psychological research in the decades following the genocide. Studies have documented that the children of survivors often experience what has been called secondary trauma, or transgenerational trauma, absorbing the anxieties, the fears, and the behavioral patterns of their parents, even though they did not directly experience the traumatic events. A descendant of survivors described this experience. "I tried, but for a large part of my life I couldn't understand what they had been through. Every Holocaust survivor has a unique experience, but all have suffered loss." This descendant also described a revealing experience during a visit to a genocide museum. "I clearly remember entering the concentration camp section of the exhibit, my lungs filling with cold, heavy air, a sudden suffocation of dread and panic. The thought of this could have been me creeping through my mind." Psychological research has confirmed that genocide survivors experience psychological consequences that lasted throughout their lives. One study noted that Holocaust survivors had poorer psychological well-being, more post-traumatic stress symptoms, and more psychopathological symptoms than comparable populations who had not experienced the genocide. But the survivors also demonstrated a remarkable resilience, building new lives, forming families, contributing to their adoptive communities, and finding ways to move forward despite all they had lost. This resilience did not mean that the trauma disappeared. Rather, it coexisted with it, allowing survivors to function in the world, while carrying memories that would never leave them completely. The ability to give testimony became, for many survivors, an important way to process their experience and to find meaning in what they had lived through. Organizations dedicated to collecting and preserving testimonies, like the Shoah Foundation, established by Steven Spielberg, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, have gathered tens of thousands of survivor stories, creating an invaluable archive for future generations. Each story is unique, as one writer observed. "Every story was told like a miracle, the way any survivor's story is told. The exquisite set of coincidences and acts of bravery. But while each story is individual, together they form a collective testimony of the human capacity for both suffering and survival, both for cruelty and compassion." Let us return now to the American soldiers who discovered the camps, because their testimony is equally essential to complete the picture of what occurred in those decisive days. The veterans who participated in the liberation left records of their experiences that complement the survivors' testimonies and provide a different but equally valuable perspective on the significance of those events. The process of collecting testimonies from liberating veterans began relatively late, decades after the events themselves. During the early post-war years, there was little institutional infrastructure to document the veterans' experiences, and many of them preferred not to talk about what they had seen. It was only from the 1980s and 90s onward, as the generation of veterans began to age and greater awareness emerged about the importance of preserving these testimonies, that systematic efforts to collect them were undertaken. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has been particularly active in this effort, collecting oral testimonies and written histories from veterans who participated in the liberation of the camps. These testimonies reveal the variety of experiences and reactions the soldiers had, from the initial shock to the lasting effects on their later lives. A consistent pattern in these testimonies is the difficulty veterans experienced in communicating what they had seen to people who had not been there. Words seemed inadequate, descriptions insufficient to convey the reality of the camps. Many veterans discovered that when they tried to talk about their experiences, their listeners reacted with disbelief, discomfort, or simply changed the subject. The veteran Charles Gruber described this frustration. "When I came home, I tried to tell my family what I had seen in Buchenwald. My mother listened for a few minutes and then said, 'I don't want to hear any more about that. The war is over. It's time to move on.' And that was it. I never spoke to her about it again." This societal reticence to hear about the horrors of the genocide contributed to the silence that many veterans maintained for decades. The result was that a significant part of the liberation experience remained undocumented for years, with memories that existed only in the minds of those who had lived them, without being transmitted to subsequent generations. But gradually, as the decades passed, and society developed a greater openness to confronting the traumas of the past, more veterans began to speak. Some did so motivated by the desire to combat denialism, which had begun to emerge and which denied or minimized the reality of the genocide. Others did so because they felt that advanced age imposed upon them the urgency to leave a record before it was too late. The veteran Maurice Gruber, who participated in the liberation of Mauthausen, began giving public testimony only when he was over 80 years old. "My whole life, I kept these memories inside me," he explained. "I didn't talk about them, not even with my wife. But when I started hearing people saying the Holocaust never happened, that it was a fabrication, I knew I had to speak. I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. And I wasn't going to let anyone say it hadn't happened." This commitment to testimony as a way of combating denialism was shared by many veterans, who felt that their direct experience imposed a special obligation on them to speak out. Their testimonies provided first-hand evidence that complemented documentary records and survivor testimonies, creating a web of evidence that made it impossible to honestly deny the reality of the genocide. But testimony also fulfilled other functions besides the historical and anti-denialist ones. For many veterans, the act of talking about their experiences provided a form of delayed processing of trauma, an opportunity to make sense of memories they had carried in silence for decades. Psychologists who worked with liberating veterans observed that many of them experienced a sense of relief and resolution after sharing their stories, as if they could finally close a chapter that had remained painfully open. What happens when a trauma remains unprocessed for decades? How does it affect the individual to carry memories they cannot share? And what is lost for society when the experiences of direct witnesses are not transmitted to the next generations? These questions acquire additional urgency as a generation of survivors and liberators nears its natural end. With each passing year, more voices are permanently silenced, more potential testimonies are lost forever. Efforts to collect and preserve these testimonies have intensified in recent decades, precisely because of this urgency, but inevitably many stories will never be told. The legacy of the Nazi concentration camps continues resonating in the contemporary world in multiple ways. The lessons of the genocide have informed the development of international humanitarian law, the creation of institutions dedicated to the prevention of genocide, and educational efforts to transmit the memory of these events to the generations that did not live them. But the legacy also includes unresolved questions, continuous debates, and persistent challenges. Have we truly learned the lessons of the Nazi genocide, or are we condemned to repeat variations of the same mistakes? Are current international institutions capable of preventing similar atrocities, or do they remain as powerless as they were in the 30s and 40s? And how do we keep the memory of these events alive when direct witnesses are no longer with us? The genocides that have occurred since the end of the Second World War in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur and other places suggest that the lessons of the Nazi genocide have not been completely learned. Each of these events has had its own specific causes and circumstances, but they all share common elements with the Nazi genocide: the dehumanization of entire groups, the mobilization of ethnic or religious hatred, the acquiescence or complicity of the international community, and the failure of institutions designed to prevent such atrocities. The vow of never again, proclaimed after the discovery of the Nazi camps, has proven to be more an aspiration than a reality. But efforts to fulfill that promise continue, informed by the memory of what American soldiers discovered in those spring days of 1945. The history we have told in these pages is only a part of a much broader narrative, a narrative that continues to develop with each new testimony collected, each new research published, each new educational effort undertaken. The memory of the Nazi genocide is not a closed issue of the past. It is a living process that involves every generation in the task of understanding, remembering, and applying the lessons of history. The American soldiers who liberated the camps became, without having chosen to, witnesses to one of the darkest chapters in human history. What they saw marked them forever, transforming their lives and their worldviews in ways that many of them could only articulate decades later. Their testimony, along with that of the survivors they found, constitutes an invaluable legacy for humanity, a permanent reminder of what we are capable of both suffering and inflicting. But the ultimate meaning of that legacy depends on what we do with it. The memories of the camps, the images of piled bodies and skeletal survivors, the stories of extreme suffering and extraordinary resilience only have value if they inspire us to act, to remain vigilant against the forces of hatred and dehumanization, to defend the dignity of every human being regardless of their origin, religion, or identity. That is the responsibility that has been passed down to us by those who were there, both those who suffered and those who liberated. It is a responsibility that we cannot evade, that does not diminish with the passage of time, that is renewed with each generation, that assumes the task of remembering and acting upon that memory. Are we up to that responsibility? Have we learned the lessons that history offers us? And what will we do, each one of us, to ensure that the words "never again" finally become a reality? These are the questions that remain echoing as we conclude this part of our narrative. But the history does not end here. There is more to tell about the testimonies of the survivors, about the later lives of the liberators, about the long process of justice and memory that has continued for decades. Let us continue then exploring the depths of this history, because every additional detail brings us closer to a complete understanding of what the discovery of the Nazi camps meant, of what it meant for those who were there, and of what it must mean for all of us who inherit their testimony. In the weeks and months following the initial liberation of the camps, the process of documentation and the search for justice intensified. Specialized investigation teams were sent to the liberated camps to gather evidence that would be used in the trials of war criminals. These teams included lawyers, translators, photographers, and forensic specialists, all working against the clock to preserve testimonies and evidence before they deteriorated or were lost. One of these teams was the War Crimes Branch of the United States Army, which operated under the authority of the Judge Advocate General. This unit was responsible for investigating specific crimes committed in the camps, identifying the perpetrators, and preparing cases for prosecution. The work was meticulous and often emotionally exhausting, requiring the investigators to review graphic evidence of atrocities day after day for months. Colonel Murray Gruber, who directed one of these investigation units, described the process in his memoirs. Every day we reviewed documents, interviewed witnesses, examined physical evidence, and every day the scale of the crimes became clearer and harder to understand. How do you process the information that a single camp processed hundreds of thousands of victims? How do you assign individual responsibility when the crime was committed by an entire system? These questions regarding individual responsibility versus systemic responsibility became central to the war crimes trials. The accused frequently argued that they were simply following orders, that they were small cogs in a much larger machine, that they had no real power to resist or change what was happening. Prosecutors, for their part, argued that every individual had the capacity to choose, that illegal orders should not be obeyed, and that participation in mass crimes carried personal responsibility, regardless of the institutional context. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, which tried the main Nazi leaders between November 1945 and October 1946, established fundamental precedents on these questions. The tribunal rejected the defense of superior orders, holding that individuals are responsible for their actions even when acting under orders from their superiors. It also established that certain crimes, such as genocide and crimes against humanity, are so grave that they transcend national jurisdictions and can be judged by international tribunals. Of the 22 main defendants at Nuremberg, 12 were sentenced to death, 7 received prison sentences, and 3 were acquitted. The death sentences were executed by hanging on the 16th of October 1946, except in the case of Hermann Göring, who committed suicide the night before by ingesting a cyanide capsule he had managed to hide. But Nuremberg was only the beginning of a much broader justice process. In the following years, Allied military tribunals and German denazification courts prosecuted thousands of lower-ranking war criminals, concentration camp guards, administrative officials, doctors who had performed experiments on prisoners, businessmen who had exploited slave labour. Some of these trials resulted in severe sentences. Others, especially as the priorities of the Cold War began to influence Allied policy, resulted in lighter sentences or acquittals. The Dachau doctors' trial, held between December 1946 and August 1947, was particularly significant. 23 doctors and administrators were tried for their participation in medical experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners. The evidence presented included detailed descriptions of hypothermia experiments, altitude experiments, deliberate infection experiments, and other procedures that had caused extreme suffering and death to hundreds of victims. The tribunal sentenced 16 of the defendants, 7 of them to death. But perhaps more significant than the individual sentences was the establishment of the Nuremberg Code, a set of ethical principles for medical research with human subjects that emerged directly from the revelations of the trial. The code established that the voluntary consent of the subject is absolutely essential, that experiments must yield fruitful results for the good of society, and that unnecessary physical and mental suffering must be avoided. These principles would become the basis of modern medical research ethics, a lasting legacy of the post-war trials. Other trials focused on specific crimes committed in individual camps. The Dachau trials, for example, prosecuted former guards and administrators of the main camp and its subcamps. The Bergen-Belsen trials prosecuted personnel from that camp, and so on, with each liberated camp generating its own set of judicial proceedings. The testimonies of survivors were essential in these trials, providing direct evidence of the crimes committed. Many survivors travelled to Germany to testify, facing their torturers once and again in the courtrooms. For some, the experience of giving testimony was cathartic, an opportunity to confront those who had caused them so much suffering and to see justice finally arriving. For others, it was re-traumatizing, forcing them to relive experiences they had tried to forget. The survivor Samuel Gruber, who testified in several post-war trials, described the experience. When I walked into that courtroom and saw those men sitting there, the men who had murdered my family, I felt a mix of emotions that I cannot adequately describe. Rage, fear, satisfaction, sadness, all mixed together. When I started to testify, my voice was trembling, but I kept going. I had to do it, for all those who could not speak for themselves. But the justice process was imperfect and in many cases incomplete. Many war criminals escaped prosecution, fleeing to countries that had no extradition treaties or that sympathized with their causes. Some took refuge in South America, especially in Argentina, where one Perón's regime welcomed numerous Nazi fugitives. Others found protection in Arab countries, in Spain under Franco, or even in the United States, and other Western countries that recruited Nazi scientists and specialists for their Cold War programs. The most notorious case of delayed justice was that of Adolf Eichmann, one of the principal logistical architects of the Jewish genocide. Eichmann had escaped from Germany after the war and had lived under a false identity in Argentina for 15 years. In 1960, agents from the Israeli intelligence service located him, kidnapped him, and brought him to Israel to stand trial. The trial of Eichmann, held in Jerusalem in 1961, was an event of enormous historical significance. For the first time, a tribunal was specifically judging the crimes committed against the Jewish people during the Nazi genocide, and doing so in a sovereign Jewish state. The trial was televised and followed by audiences all over the world, providing a massive education on the nature and scale of the genocide. The testimonies of survivors were central to Eichmann's trial, with more than 100 witnesses describing their experiences in ghettos, concentration camps, and extermination camps. These testimonies provided a detailed public record of the suffering caused by the policies that Eichmann had helped to implement, putting human faces to the abstract statistics of millions of victims. Eichmann was sentenced to death and executed by hanging on the 1st of June 1962. He was the only person executed by the State of Israel in its entire history, reflecting the exceptional gravity of the crimes for which he was condemned. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, who covered Eichmann's trial for the New Yorker magazine, coined the phrase "the banality of evil" in her analysis to describe what she observed in the defendant. Arendt argued that Eichmann was neither a sadistic monster nor a fanatical ideologue, but a mediocre bureaucrat who had participated in massive crimes primarily out of obedience to authority and a desire to advance his career. This observation, although controversial, raised profound questions about the nature of evil and about the moral responsibility of ordinary individuals in criminal systems. How is it possible that apparently normal people participate in mass atrocities? What social and psychological conditions allow obedience to authority to overcome the most basic moral imperatives? And what can we do to resist such pressures and maintain our moral integrity even in extreme circumstances? These questions, raised by the Eichmann trial and by Arendt's work, generated a vast philosophical, psychological, and sociological literature that continues to this day. Stanley Milgram's experiments on obedience to authority, conducted shortly after the Eichmann trial, demonstrated that ordinary people can be induced to inflict apparent suffering on others when ordered to do so by an authority figure. These findings suggested that the capacity for evil is not exclusive to exceptional monsters, but is potentially present in all of us under the right circumstances. This uncomfortable realization is perhaps one of the most important lessons of the Nazi genocide. Evil does not always have an obviously malignant face. It often presents itself with the face of normality, of obedience, of doing one's duty. Recognizing this truth is essential for vigilance against the forces that can lead to future atrocities. But let us return to the American soldiers, whose experiences have been the focus of our narrative. For them, philosophical questions about the nature of evil were less urgent than the practical realities of what they had witnessed and how those experiences affected their lives. Many liberating veterans found that their experience in the camps had permanently changed their relationship with their own communities and families. They had seen things that most people around them could not imagine, and this gap in experience created a sense of isolation that was difficult to overcome. The veteran Robert Kraft described this sensation in an interview. "When I returned to my town in Ohio, everything looked the same houses, the same stores, the same people, but I was no longer the same. I had seen too much.